All right, we're going to get rolling on our meeting today. Today, the Assembly Education Committee is holding the second of 4 informational hearings on the 5th extraordinary session in order to examine issues related to the federal Race to the Top competitive grant program. And I'd like to thank all of you for your interest in this topic and for your attendance. We're anticipating that quite a few members will be attending. Some are getting off airplanes, others are getting here and will be here soon. We have some members who are actually in other hearings today and will be coming in and out. But we need to be out of this room today. There's a large demand, hearing demands, and we need to be out of this room at 1 o'clock today because there is a hearing, a budget hearing that's scheduled here in this room at 1 o'clock. I think we can all recall that the Race to the Top competitive grants will come out to be over approximately $4 billion in funding that was appropriated as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, signed by President Obama in February, and that's to be used in a discretionary manner by the U.S. Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. We met last month to hear about the efforts of the federal government in developing the draft regulations and preliminary guidance that will govern Race to the Top, about the work that's been going on in the governor's office, and about some of the hundreds of comments that were submitted to Secretary Duncan as part of the federal regulatory process. The U.S. Department of Education is working through those comments to revise the preliminary regulations. Though no firm release date has been announced, Secretary Duncan's staff have said that the final application will be available at the end of the year, and the due date after that, after the regulations come out, the due date will be 60 days following that. We believe from the last hearing that our intelligence tells us that we are anticipating those final regulations to come out sometime in mid-November or late November. We will continue to move forward examining the 4 primary reform areas that the Obama administration has set out in the preliminary regulations and that the Secretary has indicated will not change and will form the basis for the final regulations. Today, we will more closely examine the first 2 of these 4 reform areas, that is, standards and assessments and data systems to support instruction. We will take this time to drill down a little deeper in the requirements and criteria that were proposed to be used to judge the competitive state applications and to hear comments on these topics. In our next informational hearing, which is scheduled for November 18th in Los Angeles, the location of the hearing is noted at the bottom of today's agenda. We will again take a closer examination of the 3rd and 4th of those 4 reform areas. And then in the 4th informational hearing, we will focus on understanding the final Race to the Top regulations. And this 4th hearing is tentatively scheduled for December 16th, but that date may depend on the release date of the final regulations and may be scheduled earlier or later, depending on what we hear with those with the final regulations. I look forward to hearing what our presenters have to say today and over the subsequent hearings, and hope that this does indeed generate questions and discussions from our members. One final, I mentioned earlier that one administrative note here is that we do have to finish our hearing today by 1 o'clock, so I will be trying to manage the time accordingly so that we can have an adequate time to drill down on both of these reform areas and also hear from the public at the end of our meeting. So with that, if my distinguished Vice Chair has any comments, this is your time. No? All right, okay. And so we will just dig in and begin, and we will begin our discussion on standards and assessments with Jim Solon from the Legislative Analyst's Office. Mr. Solon, thank you for being here. I know you have a handout. Do you have the handout, Mr. Torlakson?
The LAO.
Yeah, the LAO. Got it. Okay. Very good. Please proceed. Good morning. Yep. Got to get you on mic here.
Jim Solon, Legislative Analyst's Office. As you mentioned last time, we talked broadly about Race to the Top and some of the requirements and implications for California. We get to talk specifically about some of the criteria, and I'm introducing standards and assessments specifically. Going to approach the topic by talking about standards and assessment individually, talking about the requirements, where California is at the moment in relationship to those requirements, and what the challenges are going forward. So turning to page 1 of the handout, the Race to the Top initiative includes 2 grants that are related specifically to standards and assessment. One is the state incentive grant. This is the $4 billion available nationwide that we've been talking about and that states will compete for. It involves 4 major reform areas, one of which is standards and assessment. In addition to that, the Race to the Top assessment grants will be about $350 million available nationwide. These are still under development, but from what we've heard, the purpose is to help states implement some of the requirements specific to the standards and assessment requirements in Race to the Top. And so looking at what Race to the Top actually requires in this area, there are really 3 criteria that relate specifically to standards and assessment. The first is developing and adopting common standards. Now, common means joining in a consortium of states and having standards that are comparable across states. The next is like standards, developing and implementing common assessments. And finally, is developing a plan for implementing these common standards and assessments and supporting teachers during the process. Now, as you likely know, standards serve as the foundation for much of what we do in education, and so it would entail, adopting new standards would entail developing new curriculum frameworks, making sure that instructional materials are in place, making sure that the necessary professional development is available. So all of these are part and parcel with Race to the Top. Now, given these requirements, which are pretty sweeping in terms of their implications, what are the possible benefits? Why would California want to consider doing this? One of the first benefits is that according to the way the assessment system would be structured under Race to the Top, the state would have the ability to track individual student progress. Now, one way to think about this is if you have a student coming into 8th grade who's well below grade level, rather than just have them take the 8th grade test and they're obviously not going to do well on it, be able to tell whether or not they're at least making gains towards reaching grade level. As a result of being able to track individual student progress, this also has implications for other things that you do. For example, being able to look at exactly how much a student gains when you're providing professional development or potentially evaluating teachers. And further has implications for the assessment system. Really fundamentally what we're talking about are the building blocks for a revised assessment system. And one of the potential implications is that under the current federal accountability, there's just a high water mark, and if your school doesn't meet the benchmark they've set, you're considered to be, either failing or just not making your goals. Whereas this would allow you to actually look at whether or not schools are making progress towards making those objectives, even if they aren't quite there yet. So it's really a matter of not needing to single out schools that are improving. And the final is that you'd be allowed, basically by having common standards and assessment, to compare across states and have a really good sense for where California is in relation to other states and make, and potentially learn from the states that are maybe outperforming us. So turning to page 2 and looking specifically at developing and adopting common standards, The main requirement is under Race to the Top is that the state have a memorandum of understanding documenting that the state is participating in a consortium to develop common standards. Now, how will states be judged? The primary way is by looking at the number of states participating and whether the standards are internationally benchmarked. The consortium also needs to be committed to adopting common standards by June 2010. Now, there are two pieces here that are really crucial. The first is just that what they're looking for, both for standards and assessment, is overall rigor, and they're also looking to the process be collaborative. So that's something to keep at the back of your mind throughout. Turning to page 3, looking at where California is on the standards front, we're in pretty good position to meet these requirements, although there are some challenges that remain. Even prior to No Child Left Behind and the federal accountability movement, California had pretty rigorous standards in place, and so we have a demonstrated commitment to high-quality standards. In addition, on the collaboration front, in June 2009, the state joined the Common Core States Standards Initiative, which is spearheaded by the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. In a lot of ways, it's tailored to meet the objectives of Race to the Top. 48 states are participating, and the math and language arts standards would be developed by 2010, presumably. Despite the progress, there are certainly challenges that remain. For one, the state would likely need to consider replacing a considerable number of its standards, if not all. One of the potential requirements of the Common Core State Standards Initiative is that 85% of the state's standards be composed of these common standards. So there would obviously be some considerations in terms of what's being encapsulated in that 85%. What would we need to supplement with our 15%? And the even broader question is, at the end of the day, what does this mean for our standards? Would we in any way be lowering our standards by adopting the common objectives? And that's an important consideration. As you know, standards are the foundation for any assessment system and much of the education system. And turning to page 4, there are several requirements relating to developing and implementing common assessments. Many of them are pretty similar to the standards requirements. For example, we need to have a statement of intent that we're going to join a consortium working towards developing common assessments. And like for standards, we'll be judged by the number of states participating, whether or not the assessments are linked to the standards, measuring the standards. Unlike the standards requirements, there isn't really a specific timeline for the development of these common assessments laid out, but that's in part because the standards need to come first, and the Race to the Top assessment grant is still being devised. And finally, as I just mentioned, one of the requirements is that you apply for one of these assessment grants when they become available. Right now, the federal government is in the process of having hearings across the country with assessment experts to get a sense for what this new assessment system might look like. And then the competition would open roughly around the time that states have their standards in place. So, turning to page 5, in terms of where California is on the assessment front, again, we've made good progress and are in good position, but I think even more significant challenges remain than on the standards front. On the plus side, we've joined the Common Standards Initiative, which is the commitment to a joint endeavor, and have standards-aligned assessments already in place. But on the challenge side, our assessments really aren't measured or structured to measure student growth. Studies have shown that doing this would be a fairly complicated process, not impossible. And in addition, even if we were to sort of go it alone, it doesn't really address the commonality part of all of this, that we need to be developing these jointly with other states. So on the front of developing common assessments, there are a lot of challenges here. For instance, if 85% of the standards are adopted and then California wants to have additional standards on top of that, it could mean that we have a test that looks slightly different than in another state. And there, the comparability issue is in question. There are also all of the technical hurdles of developing a vertically scaled assessment, which are by no means insurmountable, but challenging. And even beyond that, assuming that we can clear these hurdles, again, the implementation issue will really be important because we're talking about revising the basis for our education system in a lot of ways. So it's making sure that there is sufficient curriculum, professional development, and understanding among educators of what sort of the new objectives might be. So given all of this, just as a quick takeaway, there are obviously a lot of challenges here and a lot of complications. By the same token, there's a huge amount to be gained by having a model that can gauge individual student growth. It has implications for instruction, accountability, evaluation. With information in a value-added system, we can better tell what state initiatives are really working versus what might just be a function of something else happening at the school. And there's federal money available specific for the purpose, which suggests, even if it hasn't been made, I think, entirely over, this could be the direction that the federal accountability system is moving in. So those are the considerations that need to be
Thank you, Mr. Solon. Questions? Mr. Torlakson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Solon. Two basic areas of question. First, and to be provocative, we don't seem to have some mechanisms in place to be ready to even change the standards. So I'm curious about your comments. We've had a bill, I've had one bill we've tried to get to the governor to sign. Jackie Goldberg had it 3 years ago, to set in place a mechanism for revising our standards, even tweaking our own rigorous standards and trying to look at how do we update with current information, current learning methodologies. And then on top of that, we've had, through this severe budget crisis, a number of cutbacks in the ability to implement current standards, including line item vetoes the governor did on updating instructional materials, basically dismantling the current curriculum framework update process and the instructional materials update process. So could you comment on those internal barriers? Will our application even be deemed credible if we don't take care of these other factors, which are sort of bottom line test of whether we can implement any change in standards, whether it's to some higher level of national standards or to some more mediocre level of national standards?
Sure. From a competitiveness standpoint, I can't say that the federal government won't look at any of the things that you mentioned, which are very real concerns. I think in general, a lot of the work, the legwork, is actually going to be done by this consortium. For example, the validation committees for the standards are national in scope and have been appointed by various governors and superintendents of public instruction. So a lot of this will be developed with a body of experts that really don't rely heavily on California's system. Now, beyond that, though, as you've mentioned, the question will be, well, how do we evaluate these internally and make sure that whatever is adopted meets our standards and is sufficient to the type of accountability system that we want to have? And I think that some thought will need to go into exactly how we would do that and who would handle that, given some of the considerations you mentioned.
So while some of the legwork may be done by this national committee, but our own ability to implement it requires statute change, correct? Or some ability to have the standards process, the standards vetted, analyzed, and brought to the Board of Education, the legislature, and the governor.
Right, exactly. I mean, through the consortium, all we really commit to is, appointing people to participate in the process, and then submitting a timeline for how we might adopt the common standards. But beyond that, as you mentioned, the ball is really in California's court in terms of what step we want to take next and how it happens.
The last question for this moment, anyway, and the panel to follow may want to comment on both areas, is the actual cost of implementing. Have your office done an analysis of the cost of implementing any level of standards, whether it's 85% or 90% or some blend of our current rigorous standards that are considered some of the best in the nation with whatever some new national benchmarks might be? I mean, we're in the midst of this incredible education school crisis. Class sizes that were 20 a year ago or 33, 35. We have teachers just struggling to get through the current standards. We don't have textbooks, instructional materials ready and available. Most districts, or many districts anyway, have opted to take the flexibility that was in the budget and not have instructional materials as part of that. The $350 million for assisting with the assessment transition process or implementation process seems a very small amount of money when we've seen $12 billion cut out of the school budget. So what is the cost of meeting some change in standards put forward by this consortium or national group? And it also, there's an underlying question: is it worth the cost of going through the change? Because you're going to have curriculum framework changes. You're going to have new instructional materials. Have you costed out that cost and what the ability is of any of the federal money to take care of those costs?
In the past, we've looked at specific costs relating to developing an assessment system that could be vertically scaled, considered some of those specifics. And from what we can tell, based specifically and limited to the standards and assessments, the $350 million grant should be sufficient to cover just the assessment part. And the standards are largely going to be developed, again, by sort of outside experts. So that's the core right there. We haven't looked specifically at the ripple effects for every other part of the education system, but to a large degree, many of the the race to the top is designed to give you the funding that you need to accomplish some of this. And assuming that California were to get a decent chunk of the $4 billion nationwide, then that would presumably cover a significant portion.
Isn't that one-time money, though? Right?
Well, it's through 2013-14, so certainly for the transition, we could build that into our budget. I mean, then assuming that the transition happens and happens smoothly, then we're back in the same position we are now, which is just that it's back to the normal state processes for dealing with those things. And certainly, if this moment could present an opportunity to revisit how we do some of those things and implement reforms in instructional materials or in some of the other areas that will be affected by a standards change.
Well, Madam Chair, I hope the ledge analysts will give us a full impact, the ripple effect look at how the total cost through the whole system would add up to implement those changes. I think we should know going in and then know what upfront money we might expect under the $350 million pot. The goal that you've set out is to get a piece of the race to the top money, and that's a worthy goal. However, how do we actually get there when we sort of operate in a crippled system right now in terms of the ability to just do the basics of assessments and keeping the instructional materials up?
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Trollixon. That is, I think, a very good question and something that we really do need to know in terms of what the costs are. And I think, based on the hearings so far, when we ask this question, everyone has somewhat of the same answer, which is to say, if we get a significant portion of the race to the top dollars, whether we're talking about data or other kinds of things, we have this one-time money that goes over a course of a couple of years to address. So in every situation, everybody's kind of claiming the same pot of money for to get California up to a particular point to be potentially competitive for the race to the top dollar. So it's just an interesting footnote. I had a couple of questions too, and I know that since the regulations now aren't finalized, some of my questions could be addressed in the final regulations, but based on the regulations as we know them right now, I wanted to get an opinion from your office, because there seems to be, everybody seems to have a different opinion with regards to applying for the first phase of Race to the Top and applying to the second phase around this issue of adoption of common standards, and whether in phase 1 you have to commit to and adopt by a certain date in phase 1, and in phase 2 you have to have already adopted to qualify for this. Can you give us an opinion on what you believe the regulations say?
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, there is a difference on the standards front. I mean, in the beginning, it needs to be a memorandum of understanding. For phase 2, I think you need to be farther along in the process, and potentially, I mean, depending on when all of this exactly happens, potentially have adopted some sort of common standards. And I mean, so there definitely is that tiered approach. I mean, it's very possible that that could change when the revised regulations come out. But again, you know, throughout this process, at any point, really, it's California's decision, regardless of whether or not we're phase 1 or phase 2. We're going to have to make a decision once common standards are out there, what we want to do, and so that won't change.
Right. So, and then I guess the second question is really about this sort of 85% of, you know, California would have to have agree to up to 85% of common standards. And I know that, you know, there was a letter from the governor and from the SBI and from the California State Board stating that California is unwilling or would not be able to commit to that 85% rule. Is that problematic in terms of being positioned in the right place for Race to the Top?
It's hard to know exactly how that will be judged. I think that really what the federal government is looking for is comparability, like I mentioned, and when you have standards that are pretty significantly different than other states, and then the assessments built on those are pretty significantly different, then that's not necessarily building towards what they're looking for. But by the same token, the other piece of that is quality. I mean, they've said first and foremost that these need to be quality standards and quality assessments. And if California genuinely feels that in some way the standards might be watered down by virtue of this process, then I think that's something that the federal government would have to take into consideration.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from members? Seeing none, we will then, we appreciate your background and presentation on this particular criteria, and we will move on to our next panel, our first panel, actually, which is Dr. Charles Weiss. Commonly, we refer to him as Chuck Weiss. And Dr. Weiss is the superintendent of schools in Santa Clara County. He is also a longtime member of the Public Schools Accountability Act Advisory Committee, and this is the committee that works on the API. We were also anticipating having Linda Kaminsky here from Upland Unified School, but Linda, we got a call late last night, and she's quite ill and is unable to attend today. But I feel quite certain with Dr. Weiss here that we will be able to cover all of our bases, and we are so grateful and appreciative of you being here and taking time out of, I know, a very busy schedule that you have to be with us. So thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you inviting me here today to talk about standards and assessment, and specifically as it relates to Race to the Top. And Thank you for the members for listening and having me here. Just to give a little more background on me, I have been on the Public Schools Accountability Act Advisory since 1999 when it was originally passed, and so helped to develop the API and all the structures within the PSAA. I also chaired the No Child Left Behind work group that developed the plan for NCLB in California. So I'm pretty steeped in accountability and assessment. My background is I was trained as a school psychologist. I still am a licensed educational psychologist. I used to develop tests, and I used to conduct program evaluations for state and federal programs throughout the state. I have been a county superintendent now. This is my 17th year, and I oversee programs that, of course, implement assessments throughout our county. The main theme of my comments today are that this race to the top gives us an opportunity to think about positive improvements in our standards, assessment, and accountability systems in California. And we're at a very critical point right now in California in that our Public Schools Accountability Act is up for reauthorization. The STAR is up for reauthorization in 2011. And at the federal level, ESEA is being reauthorized. So it's a really chance to say, what have we learned over the last 12 years about standards in California? What have we learned about accountability in California over the last 10 years? And how can we make it better? How can we evolve that? So my comments today will be positive in nature. I'm basically an optimist, so that even when we talk about not having enough funds to do everything, we still need to think about the long view and how we can make education better in the state of California. So I'll be talking a bit about standards, and then a bit about assessments, and then a little bit about accountability in the context of the broader system, not just race to the top. And as you heard, race to the top is still somewhat a moving target. The guidelines haven't been completed. And one correction I want to make while it's fresh in your mind, the LAO said that the commitment of 85% of standards was in race to the top guidelines. My understanding is, unless he's seen a copy of the new ones, they weren't in the original race to the top guidelines. That was a standard set by the state chief schools officers and the National Governors Association as being the same. So in other words, they said if 85% are the same, then they're the same. So that's an imposed standard by the group that started this conversation. So just in case I forget to say that.
Thank you.
It's actually, as I understand it, not in the guidelines. I also, some of the comments I'll make today come from a task force that I established as president of the Association of California School Administrators. Our task force is on assessment and accountability, and they are looking at international procedures for assessment, international accountability systems, also the accountability systems in all other 50 states, and making recommendations about how our system can become better in California. And we're taking those recommendations both to you as well as to the federal government as they're rewriting ESEA. So let me first talk about standards. And again, I would ask you to take the long view. There are many in this city that believe that our standards are perfect and should not be messed with. But the truth of the matter is that back in the late 90s, when Delane Easton was state superintendent, we embarked on the process to develop content and performance standards. That's what the legislation called for when they were created. The work was difficult, and it was rigorous, and it was contentious. And when they finished developing the content standards, they didn't move on and develop the performance standards. And that is a major flaw in California's system. So in essence, it's not perfect. Performance standards, standards typically talk about what you know and are able to do. Our standards are very good at talking about what you need to know. And that's why they're content standards. That's why they drive textbooks very well. They drive the content of curriculum very well. What they don't drive very well is assessment systems, because assessment systems are based on what you're able to do. And most international standards focus not only on what you know, but also what you're able to do with what you know, how you're able to apply what you know to the workplace or to a real-world situation. So in our sense, we believe that this is a great opportunity when we're talking about standards and assessment. Just as Member Torlickson's bill said, we need to look at ours and say, where do we go for the next level? Not throw everything out, because our content standards are some of the most rigorous in the nation. Cited by the Fordham Foundation as, I think they're given an A or an A+. And the Fordham Foundation just uses two criteria, just so you'll know. The two criteria for the standards they use are rigor and clarity. And there's no doubt that our standards are rigorous and clear. What they don't assess is utility, which is another major function. Utility means, what difference do they make? And so, as you probably know, we have still many in our state that believe that our schools don't produce the right kind of kids, can't do the things that they need to do for entry-level employment. If the businesses in this state engage with us in developing performance standards, they can then help us decide what are those performances that you expect of entry level. Same thing with our moving on to university. What are the entry level performances we expect of university students? So our system has created great content knowledge. We assess that with multiple choice. We have very little problem solving or critical thinking in our assessments because we don't have much performance in it. So in essence, we see it's a real opportunity here to talk about our standards and do as Tom Torlakson recommended, say what's the next step in our standards system and make sure that we have clear content and performance standards and then build assessment systems around those performance standards. In doing so, we believe that it's critically important to have many people at the table when we talk about these performance standards. And we believe that having teachers that have worked with our content standards for the last 12 years can tell us which of the standards are more essential than others. In most districts that I've worked with, there are so many standards they can't figure out how to do every single one of them, so they find the ones that are most essential, that actually point to things that are covered in other standards. And so most local assessments and even our state assessments don't assess every standard. They assess the ones that are more essential. And so that seems to send a message that maybe we need to look at our standards and say which ones are really key standards or more important standards. Also, the LAO representative mentioned that he was very concerned about the standards that might come out of the validation committee. Well, I just want to give you a little more thoughts that might be okay for us. Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond from Stanford is on that validation committee, as well as Chris Steinhauer, who is the superintendent of Long Beach. So we actually have representation on that from California, and probably more representation than most other states. So we really do have a voice there at that table for the Common Core standards. And I tell you all this just so that you won't fear that whatever is going on at the national level will necessarily be bad for us. In addition, what I think we feel is really important is that what the Common Core standards are talking about are being college and career ready. And we believe that in this state, being career ready is something that we haven't spent enough time thinking about. And so this is a real opportunity, and again, I'll come back to my optimism, a real opportunity to talk about how to make sure our kids are career ready and college ready, not one or the other, but both, and working with the industries in this state that need employees. And you've seen the research from PPIC saying that we won't have the properly trained employees for the future here if we don't do something somewhat different. He already mentioned the timeline on the Common Core standards, and we're fine with that. We believe that that timeline is probably very ambitious, given how long it took us in California to develop our content standards, and we actually punted on the performance standards. If they really want to do this right, they're not going to have them done by mid to late winter if they do it right. And so we believe that California needs to be at the table. Rather than saying we won't engage with you because we're afraid where it will go, we think it's much wiser to say we will be right there with you, pushing you to make sure the standards are as rigorous as California's, but actually go beyond or to the next level of college and career ready and performance standards. Talked about needing a review process. We believe that you should go slow to go fast. And I think you've taken that approach here, that we really need to take time on this. This is critically important. As the LAO representative suggested, it means a possible change in our curriculum content, it means a change in the way we instruct, and it means a change in the way we assess. So you don't want to rush into a process of saying, okay, here's a new set of standards. We would also encourage that at the national level with these Race to the Top standards. They really need to be thoughtful. They really need to work with the business community, the education community, and the parent community to make sure they're the right standards for our kids and for the future. Let's see, I've covered that. Oh, in addition, one of the things that California standards don't do very well is spiral across grade levels or across courses. Our standards are end-of-course standards for either a grade level, like second grade, third grade, or fourth grade, or for a course like algebra, geometry, or Algebra 2. There are common knowledges that cross those courses, and yet our assessments don't assess them. Most good assessments have overlap, so you can spiral the learning and go deeper and deeper in the learning and apply what you've learned. And we all know that there are prerequisites in mathematics, so there should be things that you learn in one area that you use again in another area. Those are the things that should be assessed in performance assessment that go across grade levels. Let's see. I talked about reintroducing AB 97. Mr. Torlakson, we need to do that. We believe that it's critically important to do that. We believe that all stakeholders need to have a say in this, and I failed to mention the legislature, the state board, and the state superintendent, as well as the others I mentioned. We believe that we need to think about how standards point to the assessments that would follow. And I'll talk more about assessments in a moment, but within standards, there are a variety of ways to go about assessing whether they've been accomplished. Some are more costly than others, and for some, the state needs information, and for others, they may not. So I'll talk about that under assessment. So actually deciding which ones are essential and which are not. In addition, the standards, we need to think through, when we're talking about standards, how students with disabilities and English learners will also have access to those standards. We believe it's time to not have a second tier or a second set of standards, but to have a set of standards that are accessible for all kids as we provide adaptations for them to get there. And we also need to make sure that we continue with English language development standards, but they're aligned very clearly to a new set of performance standards. So that's my bit on standards. Have any questions about that before I go on to assessments?
Any questions from members? I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
One, when you talked about, this development of the Common Core standards and looking at college and career ready, and looking at both of them, where is this committee going relative to that? Are they looking at a group of standards that would actually address both, so that when a child graduates from high school, they will be both college and career ready? Or are they looking at sort of a dual kind of track where it would look different from one to the other?
Well, I hope they're not doing the latter. But actually, I haven't seen. All I've seen is the stated purpose, which is college and career ready. And so, I'm hoping that it's one set of standards. If you talk to all the employers I talk to in Santa Clara County, say that there's not much difference between what they expect of their entry-level employees and what universities expect. So to me, they're very close, except they're more practical and they're more application-based, which I think even our universities would suggest our kids need.
Right. Well, I mean, clearly this is an issue that we wrestle with all the time here in Sacramento, this issue of college and career readiness, and what's the appropriate approach to do that. And I think there are a number of different opinions, and quite frankly, I think many times in the discussion that's the elephant in the room, but we haven't really wrestled with it and come to a conclusion about what that really looks like. So, I'm wondering, through this process, whether that question will be answered one way or the other.
It seems to me that we should be at the table to help answer that question. And, California's done some great work with their career technical education standards, though they're separate standards, even though they have some that are embedded in regular scholarly or academic courses. But that conversation needs to go on in California, because the future of our economy is about being ready for work as well as for college, and the two need to be very similar. There are no longer jobs for kids that are just good with their hands and their muscles and not their heads. So, and some people say, well, I don't know if my mechanic needs to know this, that. Your mechanic is running a very sophisticated computer. They need to know a lot of stuff these days. So it's not the same old vocational ed. It's a new, and I know some of the mentorial knows this, it's a new world that all kids need to be working in a problem-solving mode, in a rigorous academic mode, having high levels of science and mathematics, and really excellent communication skills. So you're going to find that college and career ready are not as far apart as they used to be.
Thank you. And you talked about the content standards and performance standards, and where California needs to probably do a better job with regards to performance standards. I think one of the criticisms of California's standards is people will say, and other researchers, et cetera, will criticize to say California's standards are, a mile wide and an inch deep. Do you have any comments with regards to that?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is talking about performances. Because when you actually design performance assessments and you design performance standards and you apply things, you actually go much deeper in understanding. A good example of that is in Australia. They have assessments of their biology standards, and they actually have students develop an antidote to a virus and write about it and how they will distribute it to the population. Our same course has a multiple choice item about which is the description of a virus. And you see the dramatic difference between those two. So the standards are critically important, and this conversation is critically important. And I don't think we should fear it. I think we should open ourselves up and say, how do we move California, along with the nation, to this next level that will really help our kids be more globally competitive?
Thank you. And then the last question I had was around measurement of growth over time. And I know that...
And I haven't done my assessment part. You want to hang on to it? Maybe
okay, I'll hang on to that. Okay, great. So moving on. Any other questions from... Welcome, Ms. Buchanan. Any other questions? So we'll move on to the assessment phase.
So thank you for deferring. I shouldn't have done that.
No, that's all right. That's very good. Keep me on track.
Okay. Just as we think that the standards ought to be nationally and internationally benchmarked, we believe our assessments need to be internationally and nationally benchmarked. We believe that California has learned a lot about standards-based assessments over the last 10 years, and it's time to improve them. And this conversation about round race to the top and around the reauthorization of ESEA is a great time to begin that conversation. Also around the reauthorization of STAR. We have an opportunity here. There's the perception that we have no money, and yet the STAR contract is hundreds of millions of dollars that could be directed in new ways. So it's a great opportunity to think about how can new assessments be created that will make our kids more nationally and internationally competitive. So we believe that our assessments are too light on assessing a student's ability to reason, analyze, and evaluate multiple sources of information and solve challenging real-world problems. And my example of that I often talk to people about is that kids today are really great at taking our California standards tests that are multiple choice. But if they're trying to solve a problem at your home or at your work and you don't give them 3 options, they can't create 3 options. And that's a travesty, because that isn't going to grow our economy. And so we need to have assessment systems that are more like in the highest performing nations in the world, Finland, China, Australia. And they use dramatically different types of assessments than we use because they're based around performance standards. So our assessments, when we rethink them, ought to focus on in-depth and essential standards, and expectations of mastery of foundation skills should be embedded in all assessments. So not just assessing the foundation skills, but going deeper. Again, what you were talking about, a mile wide and an inch deep. When we do that, it's only fair to assess once our teachers have been given the curriculum and the training to deliver that content. So we don't want to make the mistake we made when we implemented our CSTs, and that was we put the tests in place, and then we started doing the changing of our textbooks and doing professional development for our teachers. For students, it's only fair to assess them if they've had the opportunity to learn what they're being assessed on. Otherwise, the assessment is not valid nor reliable. So we have to make sure we put the horse in front of the cart, and we get it right this time. And so being thoughtful about this and not, again, going slow to go fast, putting the right things in place for the future. We also need to make sure we realign our frameworks. The Legislative Analyst's Office very correctly stated that our frameworks would need to be rethought, and yet we have a long history of frameworks in the state of California, and we can modify those to move to a new level of assessment and a new level of standards, I believe, in fairly short order compared to what it took last time and the cost it took last time. We also believe that assessments should serve their intended purpose. And that sounds like a simple thing to say, but when we design new assessments, we have to think what they'll be used for. And I think it's folly to believe that we can create a statewide assessment that can be used for everything. And what I mean by that is there's often talk about an assessment system in the state that will provide individual student information so that teachers can modify instruction. Now think that through. 6.2 million children in the state of California. How could an assessment system collect data, analyze data, and return it in time for teachers to modify the instruction for an individual child in such a time that their learning wouldn't be in a different place by the time that data came back? Right now, it takes between 3 and 6 months for us to get data back. It might get quicker in the future, but will it ever become rapid enough for teachers to actually modify their instruction to change what little Tom will learn tomorrow? The answer is no. But we do need assessments to do that, and they need to be local assessments, and they need to be driven in the classroom by teachers for feedback to the teacher, the student, and their parent. So when we talk about individual student growth, it's different to talk about it from a classroom instructional perspective and to talk about it from a statewide or a nationwide perspective. And so it opens up your opportunities for different kinds of assessment systems. In California 20 years ago, we had a matrix sampling system. In a matrix sampling system, all of your standards can be assessed, but not all students are assessed on every standard or every item. It's a way to save a tremendous amount of money, cut down testing time, but still be able to answer the question, was the standard mastered in this school or this classroom? And what needs to happen in the program to change the program to make sure that standard is mastered. So different purposes for different assessments dictate different tests. And so I would encourage you not to think about one assessment to do everything for everybody. It's psychometrically really not possible yet. Let's see. We have to make sure that our assessments are sensitive to all subgroups and are valid and reliable for each subgroup. We still have problems in the state of California with giving assessments to students on items that they have not yet been taught. It challenges the validity and reliability of an assessment if you haven't been taught the content. Just as if you might be an expert in physics, but if I give you a physics test in Russian, you probably won't be able to demonstrate what you know about physics. You will probably tell me what you know about Russian. And so we have many of our kids coming to school in the state of California speaking a language other than English, and we need to be sensitive to when they will be transitioned to the test to find out what they know about the content. And also how to scaffold that so we can find out along the way, as they're growing in their English language acquisition, what they actually know along the way. In addition, our membership in AXA is calling for elimination of redundancy and to make assessments more meaningful to high school students. Our high school students spend a tremendous amount of time in the spring taking tests, many of which tell them the same things. And so we would like, as we think about assessments, as we open up this conversation about where we should go with assessments, we want to think about how an assessment can serve multiple purposes, including placement at the university and which courses you'll take, whether or not you would get credit for something, whether or not you'll be qualified to graduate. So, for example, the exit exam plus the CSTs. So we want you to think about those kinds of things as well. And we also would like you to think about eliminating the disincentives for students with disabilities when they use modifications in their assessments. It's a major issue in the schools about when an IEP calls for a modification of assessment, and then automatically your school is degraded when you do what the law said you're supposed to do, which is follow the IEP. So we really want you to consider these subgroups. Even though they make up a relatively small portion of our student population, every student matters, every student counts in an accountability system, so we have to make sure it's valid and reliable for each student. And I have a few more comments about accountability, but do you want to take any questions you have about assessment now, about any controversial thing I may have said?
Mr. Nestande.
Thank you. If you didn't touch on it directly, but the assessments from grade to grade, growth cohort, are you able to do that in your school district?
The assessments from which cohort?
Growth cohort. Can you measure from third grade what they did this year to next year, not as a class but as an individual?
No, not with the California Standards Test. We can do it with our local assessments, yes.
Okay, yeah, that was my question. Because some school districts do, I'm finding out, but some do not.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we'd recommend is a support system for the development of local assessments. We actually envision a statewide item pool that would be accessible to districts so that they could pull down items for every standard and create their own assessments along the way so that they can do exactly what you're talking about, talk about individual student growth, and report that, most importantly, to the parents, to the teachers, and the students. Mm-hmm. We don't know that the state necessarily has to do that for us, though.
That's my question, yeah. So right now, school districts on their own can't implement this, and I don't know why they don't actually, on these growth cohorts. So you don't actually need the state to direct them or change anything to do that right now. Is that correct?
That's right, and it is going on in most districts. Most districts have local assessment systems that measure growth on individual students over time. It just doesn't matter to the state accountability system, nor to the federal accountability system.
Doesn't matter in which way?
It's not reported.
Oh, okay.
The only thing that's reported is your measurement on the California Standards Test, and on the NCLB it's whether you're proficient or not, and on the API it's whether you've grown from one level to another, from far below basic to below basic, or from basic to advanced.
So by then reporting that statewide or nationwide, then you can use that to measure internationally, as you mentioned?
Well, there is actually ways to use an accountability system that would use both statewide assessment monitoring, we would call it, as well as local individual growth models that would combine those two to talk about whether or not a school is in need of intervention. Remember, an accountability system has two purposes. One is to identify schools that need to change, that need interventions. The other is to recognize schools that are doing great work so that others can find those places and emulate them. So if that's your purpose of an accountability system, then you want to make sure that you have ways of grossly monitoring and more detailed monitoring of individual student growth. And when we do for example, our date or SATE reviews, we actually go deeper on those local assessments to see if students are progressing over time, not just whether they've met the status bar threshold.
Okay, and I'm sorry, could you give me an example? You mentioned modification of assessment in ESL. Or what's an example of that?
Well, modification of assessment, I talked about that when it came to special needs populations like students with IEPs.
Yeah.
And the IEP will call for using some sort of a prosthetic device, for example, a blind child having something read to them rather than having them read it. And so currently, when those kind of modifications are used, the student score is entered as, I think, far below basic, or it's knocked down one level. And so we're just suggesting that we need to get our policies together so that if the federal government and the state government requires us to implement the IEP, we shouldn't be penalized for it on the assessment system. That's what I was referring to there.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Ms. Buchanan.
Yeah, I apologize for being late. I'm actually supposed to be in 3 different committee meetings right now. But a couple of questions. One, going back to the standards themselves. California, we've had a reputation of having, if not the highest, among the highest standards in the nation. So the standards that are being developed by the governors, the joint standards, have we had a chance to look at those to see how they align with California standards? And I apologize if you addressed this earlier.
I did a little bit, but you give me an opportunity to say a little more.
Yeah.
I did talk about the fact that Fordham Foundation had reviewed our standards. They also reviewed the Common Core Standards, the National Common Core Standards draft that's out. They gave our standards an A, they gave them a B.
B, right.
And they only use 2 criteria, is what I mentioned earlier. One is clarity, and the second is rigor.
Right.
What they don't use is utility, which would be what value is the standard? Mm-hmm. Is there some other place in the world that it's utilized? Does it help you do something else? And that's the whole piece that I think is missing from the conversation. And what my friend Glenn Thomas told me the other day that he said the math standards of the Common Core were somewhat below our graduation standards. And that's, again, why I suggest we need to be at the table.
Absolutely.
Because I believe that the administration's interest, from what I've learned when I was back there a couple of weeks ago, is they're interested in raising the standards for the entire nation. So if it's brought to their attention that this one is below a state standard, then we should be able to be at the table and lobby for saying this is where it ought to be. And I think we can make a very compelling case why mathematics needs to be highly rigorous for future employment.
So when the requirement is that those states that participate implement 85% of the Common Core standards, seems like we should be pretty much there, or not? Do you know?
I don't know, but I did mention that that's not a requirement of Race to the Top, to my understanding.
Right, it's a requirement if you're participating, right?
In the governor's group, yeah.
Right, but Race to the Top requires that you participate in a multi-state consortium of...
Again, what I would suggest is if we're at the table and if we have compelling reasons why our standards are the best standards, then I would believe that we wouldn't have a lot of modification to do. I think, though, we can learn something from the conversation about standards, because I think we've missed the whole conversation about performance standards, which is what you know and are able to do with what you know, so the application of knowledge.
And then getting into the assessment side, my understanding is that we need CalPADS for a number of reasons, but we haven't had a data system that would allow us to attract student growth over time. So as we have that, it will help track from year to year.
That's only part of the reason we're unable to track student growth over time. The other is our assessment system, that we really don't have an assessment system that has assessments that are linked from one course or level to another. We have end-of-course tests from 2nd through 6th grade, and then we have end-of-course tests beyond that based with the title of the course. So it's because we don't have overlapping skills or performances across those, it's very difficult to say whether or not a student's performance in 3rd grade is any different than their performance in 4th grade. They might end up at the same level, like proficient or advanced, but it doesn't really tell us if they've progressed, because the way those levels were set, as you probably well know, they were just lines drawn on a distribution chart.
Right.
They weren't set by, does this performance mean that a kid actually has mastered that standard, which is really a very different conversation than the way we did it at the state board. They put up all the scores and they said, that looks like it should be proficient.
So what you're really saying, this is in the argument of where they say that they're not they say they're criterion reference tests, but they're really not because
they
of how
actually
they develop them. Right.
applied a norm reference model to a criterion reference assessment
test,
system.
right.
Yeah.
And so that I know that's the big controversy.
Yeah. And that's why the federal government a couple of years ago made them go back and develop performance level descriptors, because they said, so you get a score of 385 on the CASE, what does that mean you can do? And the answer is, it means you'll get a score of 385 next time you take it.
That's exactly
That's
right.
really what it means. And
Or
so
if
that's what we need to change.
Or if everyone's performing at a higher level and we're doing a better job educating them, but you continue to do, you continue to assess the same way, you're never going to actually, even though individual students are performing at a higher level, it's never going to show up in test results.
Yeah.
So, but my next question is, it seems to me that the public demands, and certainly we're hearing more of this, that we have some kind of yardstick for evaluating student and school performance and comparing one school district to another. And certainly, whether it's STAR test or whatever, that once-a-year test is going to do that. But my experience is those tests are really not the most meaningful way to drive instructional improvements, because when you test a student in April or May and get the results in July or August, the students have gone on to the next year, and you're not able to.
She agrees with me. See,
right,
I said that
to
earlier.
change what you're doing. So the systems that I've seen that work the best are the ones where, at individual sites, they've developed a culture where they're taking the 20 standards, the mild, wide, inch deep. They're taking the 20, 30, however many standards you have, condensing them down into the essential power standards, information and knowledge that the student needs to be able to be successful at the next level. And then the teachers themselves are developing their own formative assessments that they're giving every 4 to 6 weeks. So, given that, it really seems to me that, we're sort of misleading the public in a way to believe that if we just have, common assessments, which I do believe we should have. I mean, if you're going to make education a national priority, if you're going to have national standards, you shouldn't have different tests for students here in California than tests and students in Texas, or, I know in Texas they don't test all their English learners until they're proficient, so it's hard to compare scores. But aren't the real improvements going to come when each school is able to empower its teachers to give them the time and support they need to have these formative assessments, and they can, instead of waiting to see if Johnny's doing well at the end of the school year, they're continually looking at those assessments throughout the school year and using that data to provide the time and support students need to either achieve proficiency or perform at even higher levels?
You're absolutely right. And the only thing I added to that was I think it's in the state's best interest to help develop an item bank that helps teachers do that. Because expecting teachers to write items that are valid and reliable is just not in their training. And so giving them an opportunity to look at some of the best assessment items in the world and pick from those, because they're all linked to standards, and develop their assessments around that through a system like the EduSOS system, or the one we have in Santa Clara County called School Plan. But basically have an item bank where you could download those, develop your local tests, print them out, have the kids take them, or even take them online, which would really be ideal. Get immediate feedback, find out how you're doing, and then modify instruction the next day.
And I agree with you, but I also believe that the more you involve teachers, then the more you also understand how powerful it is to use data and the results of tests to drive your decision making and your lesson planning and how you're meeting the needs of students, because the more we impose from the outside, the tougher it is to really have the kind of meaningful changes.
Right, and I wasn't suggesting we impose a certain test. I was just saying we give them a resource to use. If teachers in groups want to design their own, that would definitely be an option. But you have there are certain standards for item development that we could help them with, and it's not part of regular teacher training to get that kind of training. But I agree with you 100%.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I just follow up on that? When you mentioned, and I think I followed where you're going about, say, do an online test and you can change the curriculum immediately then, if you do an online test. What's the impediment to doing that right now then? When you said before it took 3 or 6 months to get
It's
the
not.
data
There are
back.
districts doing that right now.
Okay, so there's
It's just
nothing
not
we would
ubiquitous.
need to change to do that.
I'm sorry?
There's nothing we need to change to enable them to do that then?
Not really. Not in what we're conversing about today. It's available right now. There are software packages that help districts do that. They're just not everywhere in the state. Not every state has invested in that. And my recommendation would be to see that part of an accountability system. Once it becomes part of an accountability system, then it would become more common. as opposed to some of the best schools are doing that, and some of the other schools are not. So it becomes a real system for assessment.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so Chuck, I just wanted to follow up on that too, because you're saying that most, maybe not all, schools or districts are already utilizing formative assessments and to help inform instruction and so forth and so on. But I mean, I don't know because I haven't seen the data, but I would presume that the districts that are doing that are the districts who are achieving at higher standards than districts who aren't doing that. So I'm assuming that our lowest performing schools, for example, are districts or schools who aren't who are not doing that, who have not developed their own assessments to do that, who are not collecting the data to be able to do that. Do you know that? Is that a correct hypothesis, or is it?
Yeah, it really depends on how you define lowest performing. If you're talking about lowest performing based on an absolute standard, there are probably a lot of other reasons that they may be at that lower level. For example, decile ones. I always love the conversation about decile ones. There's always going to be a decile one. And so this may be a school that made tremendous growth, and yet they're still in the bottom 10%. That school may be using all the research that suggests that when you do regular and interval assessments and use that to change instruction, it's a huge effect size. I can't remember the number, but it's in the upper, like in 0.7, 0.8 effect size, huge effect size. So the districts that have read that and know that that makes a difference are doing it. Whether or not all the schools that are underperforming are not doing it, I couldn't really state that, because I've seen some of the best instruction going on in deciles 1 through 3 schools and some of the weakest instruction going on in decile 10 schools, because their kids are doing well with the existing system and they don't have and don't put in these interim assessments because they don't feel like they need them. So what I know is the research is abundantly clear. When you do this kind of work, it makes a huge difference on bringing kids up in their achievement,
right.
And it should make a huge difference on state tests. So you should be able to see that.
And so with regards to Race to the Top now and standards and assessments, so what's your opinion? I asked of the LAO too, this issue of Phase 1 and Phase 2 in terms of applying for Race to the Top, and what the state has to agree to vis-a-vis committing to a common national standard. What's your perspective on that?
Well, I would go back to what I said before. I think their timeline is extremely ambitious to think they'll get these done by this winter. But even if they don't, I would suggest that if California is at the table, and California is sharing the experiences we've had over the last 12 years with standards, we should be able to affect those standards in a way that we will be able to support
right.
the outcome, and they will be part of our system. The rigor of our standards is abundantly clear. Everyone in the nation knows that. And when Secretary Duncan was here, he said, yes, there's no doubt that your standards are rigorous, but California could learn something from other states.
Right.
And what he was referring to, I believe, was that our standards don't go beyond content.
And I agree with you on that. I guess, I'm trying to address sort of a technical issue, I guess, in terms of California's position, in terms of having a successful application for Race to the Top. Now, the regulations might change, and it might say that, yeah, we do think that this is maybe too aggressive and unrealistic in terms of meeting that objective, and it might change. But based on what we know now, given the regulations, what is the technical request from your perspective in terms of this Phase 1 and Phase 2 with regards to adopting common standards?
Well, I guess the way I would answer that is that I would suggest that when an organization adopts a new set of standards, it's going to be multiple years to implement them and hold students accountable to them, because you need to first implement training for teachers and new materials, then new assessment systems, then the standards. So I wouldn't fear signing on to a new set of standards, because you know it's going to take multiple years to get it in place. I mean, a good example is graduation requirements. When you raise your graduation requirement, you don't apply it to the class that are 12th graders today because they didn't have ample opportunity to get there. You apply it to freshmen. And so even signing on with a new set of Common Core standards that are internationally benchmarked, it seems to me there will be a timeline for when you finally hold your students accountable to those, because to be fair, you must provide the instruction and you must provide the support for the teachers and the materials that change them. We learned that in California, we are still getting to the place where our standards are well understood by our teachers. So it takes time. This is a large state with a lot of change. So I wouldn't fear signing on, whatever the timeline is.
Yeah, I'm not fearful of signing on. I am just trying to trying to make a judgment call whether, we can be positioned to be successful for it,
Yeah.
so that we can kind of pursue what you're talking about. And I guess the other question for me, it's hard for me as a layperson to sort of visualize California sort of taking their content standards off the table, bringing new ones on, and sort of kind of gearing up for all of this. And also relative to, as Mr. Torlakson brought up at the beginning of the hearing, what are the costs associated with that? And certainly California clearly is not in a position at this moment in time to make any kind of investment into any reform effort, because we have no money to do so, unless we're going to if we're going to cut deeper into what we're providing funds for now to be able to do some new reform. I certainly wouldn't advocate for that. We've got to figure out how we're going to invest in reform, and I think money is not the panacea here, but it is certainly part of the solution in terms of long-term systemic reform. So what does that look like? I mean, give me kind of a snapshot of what that looks like in terms of transition for California and what that means.
Well, and I'll go
both
back
work-wise and financially.
Well, I'll go back to where I started. I think this conversation is an opportunity to start to plan for the future and take the longer view. And so even though we don't have the dollars today, we ought to know where we want to be when the dollars start to come back. And for example, the STAR contract is one of the largest contracts in the history of the world. And so there is money there. And we can either continue to use it the way we've always used it, or we can use it a new way.
So how much money is it in that contract?
I tried to find that out before I came in.
The largest contract in the world.
It's hundreds
of
millions of dollars.
It's billions and billions of dollars?
No, it's hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know how much it is.
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's a lot of money. The LAO should know how much it is. It's a lot of money. It's huge. And so, you either choose to use it the same way you've always used it, or you choose to use it in a new way. And again, I'm an optimist. I think that what leadership is about is looking at the long view and saying, how do we take the opportunity today to create a better tomorrow?
Right.
And that's what we have the opportunity to do. So even though we may not be able to invest in it tomorrow, we should know where we want to go so we can invest in it next year or the year after that.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question that I had was around growth models. And I know the governor signed AB 1130 by Mr. Solorio, and I'm very supportive of that bill. And I think that moves us in the right direction around growth. I also had a bill that looked specifically at a bill that would have looked specifically at individual student growth, and I think Mr. Solorio's bill looks more at cohort growth, school growth, district growth, and maybe through that we could extrapolate out from that data individual student growth. But so I'm wondering, from your vantage point, if there is, again, relative to Race to the Top and trying to do this correctly, do you think there's still a small piece here, or maybe a large piece that still hasn't been addressed for us to move forward to really provide a real, genuine, authentic student growth model?
Yes. I mean, I think we're all in agreement that a growth model is critical. That at a status bar only model, it doesn't really help us identify the right schools. So we need a growth model with some sort of target, kind of like we have with the API right now. It's not a growth model per se, it's an improvement model, but it does reward schools for moving up, and it also has a target of 800 to move toward. So I think that's the right approach. That's the approach we are really pushing hard with the federal government, and we do think that works. We think the conversation about individual versus cohort is a critically important conversation because it adds up to money. And it adds up to the value of a given assessment system. And I think I talked about that earlier. The question that the state should ask itself is, do we have an interest in individual student information, or do we have an interest in school level, classroom level, and district level information to monitor whether or not progress is being made? So I think under the Solorio bill, I think there's the tools there to move toward a growth model and even design an assessment system that is different than the one we have now around these new college and career ready standards. So I think that provides us a great tool to do that. But we do need to have that conversation about what is the state's role in individual student information. I believe that it's really a classroom level, parent level, and student level need, not necessarily a state level need. And it creates a very different kind of amount of data you collect, the kind of assessments you do, how many standards you have to set. And one of the things that people that don't develop tests may not understand is when you're developing a standards test, you have to have enough items per standard to know if the standard was mastered. And if you look at the blueprints of our current standards, some standards have 1 item, some have 10. A standards-based test should have roughly equivalent number, and then you should be able to say that maybe 3/4 of the items correct or 80% of the items correct would suggest you've mastered it. We can't currently say that with our current assessment system. Even though we give the same test to every child, we still can't say if they're indeed mastering the standards. So those are some questions that need to be answered when you develop a new accountability system. And the question is, who needs to know that? And the answer is, I don't need to know if Julia actually mastered this standard as a state, but as a teacher, I need to know it.
Absolutely.
And the student needs to know it.
I couldn't agree more.
And the parent needs to know it.
Yeah.
So I would suggest a tiered type of assessment and accountability system that uses local data, but also uses a statewide monitoring system, possibly around cohorts that are classroom level, school level, and district level, so you can talk about whether or not the program's being implemented. I don't know if that's too complex in answering your question, but it's a different way of looking at it than we do it today. It's more similar to what we did 20 years ago.
And you had mentioned in your presentation, too, that the common standards from this consortium is already out. But those are common standards, just sort of exit standards. They aren't the grade level standards. Right. And so just give me an idea of where the work is relative to grade level standards.
We're told that the grade level standards are supposed to be produced by mid to late winter. Again, I would suggest that's ambitious. And if they, there have been, nationally, there's been several groups working on standards across the nation for almost 20 years. And you have, what they ended up doing is breaking apart and saying, okay, the math people have their standards and the science people have their standards, and nobody really adopted them totally. I suspect that this conversation around grade level standards will take some time. And I suggest that they won't have them done by winter. But, that's just my experience.
But you're an optimist, remember?
I'm an optimist. I'm optimistically thinking they could get it done within a year.
Right. Okay. And my last question. Okay. So I shouldn't ask that question? Okay. All right. All right. All right. I don't have any more questions.
Okay.
I've been told.
So is that personal question you're not supposed to ask me?
Time. Are there any other questions from members? Welcome, Ms. Fuller. Thank you for joining us. And please don't hesitate. If you have a question, just let me know. It sounds like you might have one.
One very quick comment. I appeared today mostly because I wanted to reinforce that this is one of the brightest guys who graduated from UC Santa Barbara with a PhD. And I have followed his career closely because when I disagreed with him, we did a face-to-face, and he's usually always right. So I don't really have any questions for him, but I will be reading closely your remarks. Thank you for bringing him here today.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller, very much. Thank you, Mr. Weiss. We really appreciate you being here, and we look forward to continuing working in this important area.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panel, trying to keep us on track, and that's what my devoted staff members trying to help me do, is keep me on track here. Our next panel includes Michelle Herzog with the Los Angeles County Office of Education, and also a member of the Curriculum Development and Supplemental Materials Commission, and Holly Jacobson with the California School Boards Association, and another member of the Public School Accountability Act Advisory Committee. We in education should make these titles simpler. Also, our third member of the panel is Isabel Garcia from the California Teachers Association. Again, we thank you all for being here. And I don't think that there's really a sequence in which we should go, but we'll ask Michelle Herzog to start.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. I was asked to come and speak with you a little bit about the Common Core Standards Initiative, what that potentially means for California, what are probably the costs and the benefits of that. And I was so glad that our previous panelists covered so much of that. That helps me a great deal, so we'll just be reiterating a lot of that same information. I think you would all agree that we can appreciate the rationale from the federal government for wanting to establish these national core standards. We have states that have different expectations all over the place, and that becomes very apparent, of course, when we see test scores come out from NAEP, where scores are all over. And the recent NAEP scores that just came out for math, again, showed that. So it's kind of, how do you compare apples and oranges when different states have different standards for those areas? And we found, too, in the latest NAEP scores for math that, interestingly enough, the fourth grade math scores remained flat, and that hadn't happened since 1990. But there were 4 states, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, 3 states, pardon me, who had increases in fourth grade, and they attributed that to their states coming together and developing some common core standards in mathematics. So it was an interesting point that was brought out. You know all the groups that are involved with the National Core Standards Initiative. Now there are 51 states and territories that have signed on to supporting the effort, though of course not all are committed to adopting them all. And you heard also the Fordham Foundation's evaluation of the draft English Language Arts and Math standards that have just been published. They rated it a B, and as Dr. Weiss pointed out, of course, it's based on clarity, specifics, content, and rigor, but don't really speak to kind of the performance aspect of those standards. So what are the potential benefits for California for us to move forward in that direction? You heard from the other panelists where many feel that the current California standards lack that performance assessment aspect to them. It's been 10 years since our standards were adopted. And you're seeing, of course, a lot of voices in the field and legislation that's put forward for a huge need, a huge desire to re-examine our current standards and update them. And we haven't done that in over 10 years. So a lot of groups are seeing this as a great opportunity. We talk about, yes, our current standards are very strong in rigor and content, but the question remains, what will students do with them? It's one thing to have the knowledge, but what will you do with the knowledge? How will you apply it? How will you make it relevant? And I wanted to bring up another point that hasn't been discussed thus far, and that's the issue of high school dropouts. We know we have a critical problem in this state, and the numbers are kind of funny because there's different ways of measuring it. But we know that almost about a third of our kids are dropping out of high school. And in some schools down in LA, it's up to 50%. And when you look at the research behind dropout prevention, and this spring we had a series of summits, youth summits up and down the state where we invited high school kids, high school dropouts, and students from continuation schools. And we asked them, why are so many of your peers dropping out? And of course they spoke to a number of different issues, personal, family, community issues, but when we asked them about what's going on in school, the consistent message we heard was that school is not meaningful. What I get in the classroom is not relevant to my life. So many see this look at expanding, developing, adopting Common Core standards in that light to be a value added for kids, an opportunity to make our standards more relevant and meaningful. The California Math Council has national math standards that they support, and they feel that those are very strong in providing aspects around reasoning, including the relevance of mathematics, about talking about the spiral effect, how math skills flow more genuinely from grade level to grade level. They see the Common Core standards as an opportunity to go in that direction. For English language arts, it's a possible opportunity to expand in and explicitly state English language arts standards in grades 9 through 12, because now here in California they're kind of lumped into one area. The conversation also has to come up about the other core content areas. I mean, currently they're just looking at English language arts and mathematics. So the question begs, will there be a discussion open around history, social science, and science as well? Because those educational communities are very, very concerned too. Will they be included in the Common Core discussions? Will they be developed down the road? I know there's some initial conversations going on in Washington. They're wanting work on this first, of course, But there's the hope from those communities that those content areas will be included too. And they, again, those areas too have reached consensus because they currently feel that our standards now in history, social science, and science, like you said, are a mile wide and an inch deep. They say there's way too many to cover. They're very detail-oriented and often don't get to the real meaning and concepts and key understandings that we hope to achieve through those. The California Science Teachers Association talks about the need to have more experiential, hands-on, relevant science teaching so that kids aren't learning science just to memorize facts, but they're applying it in real-world ways, of course, through technology. In history, social science, they talk about, yes, it's very strong in rigor in history, but are there ways to apply that knowledge of history to really create a citizenry that's informed, participatory, and engaged, so that the past becomes prologue to the future? And we see public education as a way to create an educated and engaged citizenry. English language development community, of course, is very happy to see English language development standards in California to help frame and help educators in the core areas. They, of course, would like to see discussion down the road for that at a national level. And there's another group that I think Mr. Weiss spoke about, but not specifically, and that's the Partnership for 21st Century Skills. This is an initiative out of Arizona. 14 states have adopted it, and it's all about how do we prepare young people for the business world, career in college, and including and emphasizing the need for kids to be good problem solvers, creative thinkers, analytic thinkers, innovators, because the sense largely from the business world that you've heard is kids are coming out of college with lots of knowledge but are not as apt at really solving the problems and addressing issues in the business world and in society. So if the Common Core standards focus on a few important key issues and concepts that allow teachers to go deep in those content areas through analytic thinking, problem solving, innovative and creative work, then we have a dual purpose achieved. So many are seeing that as an opportunity for adopting the Common Core standard. All right. So then the other flip of the coin, because my role here is to present all the sides that I'm aware of, is be careful what you wish for, and that's that discussion that we have to look at. So we already have English language arts and math draft standards out. The reviews are starting to come in. There's been some criticism that there's a lack of transparency in how those are being developed and who's at the table and who's not at the table. Those are important decisions. There are concerns that if we put too much into standards and we don't invest enough on good assessment design, on lesson plans, on professional development, on all the other areas that impact teaching and learning, we're missing the boat there. So this cannot be seen as a panacea for all we need to do. Some of the reviews are out already on the math draft standards. Fordham Foundation, you heard, rated it a B. There's some positives and there's some negatives. So there's still a lot of give and take on whether you like them or you don't. And the same for the English language arts standards. So it's easy to say, yes, we're all for common standards until we see them in front of us and we go, well, I didn't mean those common standards. I want my common standard. So that, of course, is a real consideration. And
Ms. Herzog, just for time management purposes, we need to,
okay,
I'm looking at the time, so we want to hear your full presentation, but I also have to be cognizant of time. So,
all right, thank you. And I'll just wrap up because a lot of these other issues were mentioned too, the resources, the professional development, the assessment, and that ripple effect that he talked about of the costs and what it would take to fully implement.
Thank you very much. And we'll have Ms. Jacobson from California School Board Association.
Good morning. I'll be brief. A lot of what I was going to say has already been said. As you can imagine, there seems to be a lot of uniformity in thinking around this issue. Obviously, CSBA is very supportive of revising the standards. It's been a position that we've had over time. It's something that needs to be happening and built into the system, and this race to the top conversation is providing a great opportunity and avenue for us to broach the conversation that for whatever reason at this point, we've not been successful in having the standards revised. And I think that the Algebra 1 issue that happened last year with the State Board of Education, where the State Board of Education made a decision to wholesale place all 8th graders in Algebra 1, really speaks to the complexity of revising standards. It had two issues. One, in terms of content, making a decision just to place kids into Algebra 1 spoke to us about the need to revise the standards generally. There seem to be some gaps in the content standards that we have right now. Are we dealing with fractions the way that we ought to be dealing with them, et cetera, that really highlighted the need to revise the standards. But it also spoke to the importance of looking at the system as a whole, that we can't simply revise standards without looking at how we deliver the standards. Is our credentialing process such that we are getting teachers that we need to be able to deliver a higher level of standard? What kind of professional development do we need, et cetera? So Race to the Top provides a great opportunity for us to have these conversations. Having said that, the Common Core standards, I think, are a really important resource for states, and we look forward to looking at them and examining them, but really do believe that California needs to develop its own process for revising its standards, and the Common Core will be an element of that. We need to utilize it. But in order, and I think it's been raised earlier, teachers will be delivering these standards, and while there may be some representation of Californians in that process right now, it's not something that's being embraced by Californians who would actually have to do the work. And so it will be important for us to develop a process in California where the Common Core standards are a component of what we do to revise the state standards over time. And we need to be looking at the entire infrastructure, not only the content standards, but as I described earlier, our credentialing programs, our professional development programs, and what do we do now that instructional materials and frameworks are all on hold for the next several years? How do we actually implement new standards in California? All of those things will have to be considered. We're also worried, and this hasn't been raised yet, one of the lessons that we've learned from No Child Left Behind, there's been a lot of good things in No Child Left Behind, the focus on subgroups, et cetera. But one of the things that we've learned that's been a detriment is the narrowing of the curriculum. And we have concerns about these Common Core standards only focusing on English language arts and math right now, and what will be, I think, a continued emphasis on those two subject matters at the expense of others. And if a common assessment is developed that's only aligned to those two standards that is used for federal accountability, we will continue to see that same narrowing of the curriculum that's having, frankly, the worst impact in some of our lowest performing schools who are striving so hard to get out of program improvement that they've literally jettisoned everything else in their schools. As it relates to assessment, I think that this does provide us an opportunity to talk about our assessment system. One of the things that I think has stymied California is that we do so poorly on the NAEP assessment. How could it be that we have the most rigorous standards in the nation, yet we're not growing in huge leaps and bounds beyond other states on NAEP, and it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. One of the things that we've learned is that NAEP is a very different assessment than we have in California. About 40 to 60% of the assessment time is spent on open-ended questions. It's not entirely a multiple choice test, so it digs deeper into conceptual understanding. Students not only have to get a question right, they have to be able to explain why they know that, how to apply it. And so I think that there is an opportunity for us to look at our assessment system. Assessment systems do drive instruction. We know that. We've seen it here in California, and to the extent that we can deepen our assessment, provide for more constructed response, that could absolutely drive instruction in California. But we also wouldn't want to see assessments coming into place, and I think that Dr. Weiss described this, before we actually have an infrastructure in place to be able to ensure kids are successful.
Thank you very much.
Is that concise enough?
That was very concise. Perfect. Ms. Garcia.
Yes, Isabel Garcia. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am a legislative advocate for the 340,000-member California Teachers Association. I'm also a former classroom teacher. And we thank you for your leadership to provide a transparent process for weighing in on the urgent impact of the state's desire to submit an application to compete for the Race to the Top funds. The previous panelists have eloquently and concisely laid out all the issues on the standards. Can we have smarter standards? Can we refine our standards? Yes. Are there costs involved in changing our standards and assessment system? Yes. And should we support a periodic review of our standards and assessment systems so that we can not only focus on our English learners and pupils with special needs, but also aligning it to the career technical education standards as we move forward on the preparing our students to be ready for the workforce and for college. We appreciate that you're going to look at the high cost of implementing any changes to our standards and assessment systems, and looking at the implications from all the policy areas, the curriculum frameworks, the textbooks, professional development, all of the massive changes that we would need to improve and move forward and to strengthen in the reform areas. We also want to focus on that even in the budget crisis, to put a face on it, with over $17 billion in draconian budget cuts, we've had the immediate, result of fewer teachers, over 20,000 educators. We've had the delay in the textbook adoption that was mentioned, and just the narrowing of the curriculum and courses that have been disappearing. So we're saying that notwithstanding whatever happens with the final Common Core Standards Initiative or the final RTT regulations and selection criteria, that California still has to make sure that students have all the materials and facilities that they need to meet these standards at the proficiency level, because we've mentioned how states have different kind of standards. Well, we also have a different definition of proficient in our state, and it's pretty rigorous. So we just need to make sure that all those are in place and that all the stakeholders are involved and at the table as we move forward on this. And that we fully fund all of our schools and students and districts, and so that as we have these high-quality educational outcomes for everyone, we just need to make sure that all the resources are there so that they can attain that mastery. We look forward to working with you and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Any questions for panel number 2 from members? No? Seeing none? Mr. Torlakson?
Just going back again to the question you've reiterated a couple of times, Madam Chair, besides Lejanow's office, which would be our best source, I'm thinking out loud, how do we get a more accurate picture of the total cost of implementing, and again, at the table, as Superintendent Weiss has said, getting at the table, being there is critical, but ultimately figuring out our strategy so we have a buy-in from the Department of Education, the governor, the superintendent, local superintendents, local county superintendents. How do we get that buy-in and to where the source of the money would be to actually implement this, and where do we get a more accurate analysis of those sort of full system costs that were just outlined by these 3 panelists?
Thank you for bringing that up, and I think that we need to continue to press on that so that we can gather that information. I think it's important information to have. Ms. Buchanan.
I have to say that I'm not yet convinced that adopting the national standards is going to be a complete change in our standards. I mean, we have the highest standards in the nation. We were just told our standards were given an A. Overall, the national standards were given a B. So I think, we shouldn't assume at this point in time that we're going to completely rewrite and do things differently, because, until we actually have those standards and do the comparison, we don't really know to what extent it's going to change what we're doing.
I agree, but I also think that if we're going to really look at performance standards and changing the way we assess so that it is better, more measurable, I guess, and more helpful in terms of guiding instruction, et cetera, that those could be very significant changes for California.
Well, there are 2 parts, though. One is the standards and one is the assessment. And I'm just suggesting that, certainly in terms of if we want to change assessment to measure progress over time, go to teacher-made formative assessments, do them more frequently, that's going to be a change for some districts, not all. But I'm just not convinced that the standards themselves are going to represent that much of a difference.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you very much for your presentations, and we again look forward to continuing the work around this. It seems as though, to sort of wrap up on standards and assessments, it's clear to me that there is a lot of common agreement around this issue, and I think a common agreement about where we need to go and the work involved to get there. So I'm very encouraged by that, and do believe that this will be a good opportunity. Hopefully Race to the Top will provide a good opportunity for moving ahead towards that work. So now we are going to transition to the second reform area on data systems to support instruction. And we have Stephanie Fricano here from the LAO's office again to give us basic background on this reform movement. So please present. There are handouts coming around. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll wait just one moment as the handout comes out. As the handout's going around, though, I'll let you know what I'm going to cover is going to be similar to my colleague's presentation this morning. I'm going to first, though, set a little bit of context for the education data component that's specifically within the Race to the Top, and talk for a moment about the education components that are in the entire federal stimulus package, to give you some context, because there's a lot of moving pieces for education data. Okay, looks like you all have your packet. So on page 1, I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of that context, like I said, in the larger federal stimulus package, and then I'll move in and talk about the specific criteria for Race to the Top, and I'll present each criteria and then give you sort of a status update on how California is doing in either meeting that criteria or excelling at that criteria, and I'll continue that pattern till the end. Okay, so page 1 shows how education data is really emphasized throughout the federal stimulus package. There are 4 components that we're showing here where education data is really highlighted. And just as a reminder, also, there were both formula grants in the stimulus package as well as competitive grants, and so there are some of each of these here. So this section is going to talk about both. First, the stabilization fund, which was the largest, most flexible component of the formula grants in ARA. In that grant required each state to assure that it would establish a statewide longitudinal pupil data system that met specific federal requirements. So of that largest flexible formula grant, there were very detailed requirements that we had to assure we would work towards meeting. Then we also received a formula grant, a one-time augmentation of this Enhancing Education Through Technology program, which is an ongoing program that we receive from the federal government each year, but we received this one-time augmentation as part of ARA. And that money typically, and in this case also, goes to help local education agencies improve academic achievement through the use of technology in the classroom. So the money is really geared towards locals. Those it can be used for those local assessment tools that you were talking about, professional development to help teachers use data to change their teaching, very local education use. Then moving into the competitive grants that we were talking about more specifically, the state incentive grant, which is the largest component of the Race to the Top initiative, includes several eligibility criteria, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. But we also wanted you to be aware that there's this Institute of Education Sciences grant, which is available. It's also a competitive grant that we can apply for. And applying for that and being awarded that grant could help a state to meet the stabilization fund assurance that we assured when we applied, when we received that funding, and or to be competitive for the Race to the Top, the state incentive grant. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that item also, and you can see the amounts at stake for each of those. Okay. Also, in your first hearing, you heard a little bit about in the Race to the Top criteria, there are different categories of criteria. There's some eligibility criteria that must be met, some that states earn points if the better they're doing at those criteria, and then some that are invitational or sort of nice to have criteria. And there are education technology components in all categories of those. So I've broken this down into those categories. So page 2 talks about the one criteria that must be met that's related to education data. So applying for the Race to the Top state incentive grant requires assurance of an intent to create the statewide longitudinal data system that runs from preschool through higher ed, that's P20 longitudinal system, and meets the 12 elements of the America Competes Act, which we've summarized in this handy chart below. And I'm not going to read through all of these for the sake of time, but you have this with you. It's basically the first 7 or so deal with K-12 specific requirements, student level requirements, that then could continue on, though, as we move down to 8, 9, move into continuing that into higher education. So the linkages there into higher education. Also, 10 has to deal with the ability to link to teachers and link teachers to their students, and that way you can assess performance in that manner at that level. And then there are general quality components also. So next page, page 3, California has provided this assurance. So we have said that we will create a P20 system that meets these. We provided this assurance in the first round stabilization fund application. We also have existing law in California that declares the intent of the state to create a high-quality, comprehensive, and longitudinal education data system that includes data from preschool through higher education. So we currently have that already. That statute does not specify that it will include the 12 competes elements, but it does talk about the P20 system. Okay, so page 4 moves on to the criteria that will earn us additional points if met, or more points the further we have met. There are 4 items, 4 criteria here. First item is a plan for fully implementing the P20 system. So basically, we assured that we were going to in order to get our stabilization funding. Now, as we go to apply for Race to the Top, we'll get points for how far we've progressed in that task. So in our application for Race to the Top, we need to outline how far along we are, and we'll get points further along we are. Second, if we have a plan for a high-quality plan to ensure access to and use of that statewide data, specifically so that state and local decision makers can use that data to improve, and examples that were given are instruction, operations, management, and resource allocation at both statewide and the local level. So this includes making statewide budget decisions, making local budget decisions, local instruction decisions. This is use of statewide data available for this purpose. Third way that states can earn points is by having a high-quality plan to use the data to improve instruction, specifically by allowing researchers to access both state and local education data. So the theory here is to allow researchers to do research, publish these results, and then everybody can learn from these. And the more analysis that's done of this data, the more that we can learn from this. A key to this item is that it does include both statewide and local data. And fourth, states can also earn points by having a high-quality plan to link student achievement to teachers for the purposes of publicly reporting findings for credentialing programs. So page 5, I begin to talk about how we're doing on each of these criteria. First, as far as fully implementing a P20 system that meets the 12 America Competes requirements, we recently went live with our California Pupil Achievement Data System, CalPADS, and that is a longitudinal student-level education data system, statewide, K-12 specific. And we are in development of the longitudinal teacher data system, CalTIDES. And that is a longitudinal data system, and the teacher system and the student system will be linked. So we have significant plans in place and have actually demonstrated implementation capabilities in this area in K-12. These two systems include most of the required elements for K-12, nearly all of the American Competes requirements that are specific to K-12. Small enhancements such as CalPADS has the ability to collect grades that students have earned, but districts are not required to submit the grades. So in order to meet that one small component, you would actually need to require. But for the most part, CalPADS and CalTIDES meet the K-12 requirements. The biggest need for some work in this area is on the linkage from K-12 to higher ed. Current state law does require the Department of Education and the higher education segments to develop plans to come up with ability to physically link the systems and also to deal with governance and use of data. So as you can see here on page 5, there are 2 working groups that are actually in progress right now. One working group is focused on data use and governance, and the recommendations from this group will be due by the end of this year. And another working group is more focused on the technical aspects of physically linking the data systems, or bringing the data together anyway across K-12 and higher ed. Their recommendations are due in January of 2010. On the next criteria, having a high-quality plan to allow access to and use of the statewide data to improve by state and local decision makers. We don't have a plan in place. The state does not have a high-quality plan in this area, but the working group that's focused on the data use and governance, some of their recommendations could be used to create such a plan. So that will be coming to you soon. As far as a plan to allow researchers to access state and local data and use that research to improve instruction, the state does not have a high-quality plan in this area. No plan exists. The recommendations from that data use and governance working group could be a first start at this, but again, the one key item of this requirement is that it requires researchers, for the state to have a plan for researchers to get both state and local data, and that governance group is really looking at statewide data and how that data should be accessed and governed. So a state plan for how local data is accessed is not currently in progress. There are no statewide efforts focused exclusively on improving the use of those local instruction improvements. There are no statewide efforts, for instance, to sync up or make sure all the locals are using similar local assessment tools or can share data or providing that data to researchers or things like that. Most districts do have some local assessment system and keep data, education data, and use that data locally to improve their instruction. They have their own policies for giving that data to researchers. So there is a lot of progress being done at the local level. The state is not involved in a question of how much they should be involved or how they should coordinate that. Those one-time enhancing education through technology funds that I mentioned at the beginning, we got a one-time augmentation in the ARA package. Those funds have not yet been dispersed. We've been authorized, but we have not yet dispersed them. They could be directed for the locals to improve their capabilities in this area. So there are specific federal requirements that these monies need to be used at the local level for specific purposes. You could direct that those purposes also help with our Race to the Top application in this area. Plan to report effectiveness of teacher preparation programs. In this area, no plan exists, but CalTIDES is designed to meet this requirement, so all you need to do is officially authorize that we will publicly provide those reports. Caltites will have that capability as it's currently designed. So those are the criteria where we can earn points the further along we are. On page 7 is one final criteria that is what's considered invitational. States can stand out if they have some progress in this area. And basically, the federal government is really encouraging expansion even beyond what they've asked for in the P20 statewide longitudinal system. And they're looking for states that have expressed plans for cross-agency and cross-state collaboration and linkage. And obviously, as California is still putting together its plan for a statewide P20 system, we don't currently have plans for cross-state or cross-agency collaborations, but those working groups that I talked about, the technical and the governance one, are keeping this this intention of the federal government in mind. And although their recommendations are focused on the education area, they are trying to come up with recommendations that would allow specifically workforce data or workforce type agencies to be linked in or to collaborate. So those working groups are keeping this in mind, and their recommendations should be compatible with this concept. And finally, I wanted to have a few points on the IES grant, the Education Sciences grant that's available that we could apply for. Being awarded an IES grant could help California take the needed steps toward implementing a P20 system. So by being awarded this IES grant, we could use that to begin the process of linking CalPADS to higher education segments. We estimate that if California could be awarded up to $20 million. Now, that wouldn't be enough to completely finish a P20 system, but it would be a very good start and would make significant progress in linking CalPADS with higher education. That IES grant application is due in November, and CD is currently drafting that application, and they have a cross-segment advisory group that includes all the higher ed segments, K-12, and various other parties. The eligibility criteria for this IES grant is very similar to the Race to the Top. It includes the same America Competes Act 12 elements, but it also includes 7 required capabilities, and I've listed them here. If you go back and compare, you'll find that they're almost identical to the America Competes. One notable addition, though, is that these 7 requirements specifically call out a system that includes preschool, K-12, higher education, and workforce. So although your Race to the Top grant application does not require that you be working towards a system that includes workforce, your IES grant application, which you might want to use to help you get Race to the Top, does require it. So that's one reason that the work groups are really focusing on workforce as their first cross-agency collaboration. And if you have any questions?
Questions from members? No questions? Mr. Chesbro.
I can certainly see the value of a statewide database. I'm very concerned about the state's history of developing statewide databases in a variety of different areas. How is it going, and what kind of safeguards will there be to try to make sure that we learn from some of the previous experiences that have taken decades and cost many, many tens of millions of dollars, and we certainly don't have that kind of room for expenditures from the education system if they don't result in a product that is going to accomplish what we I think clearly would be very valuable.
Those are good concerns. The state has mixed records with large IT projects. CalPADS, like I said, did come up and is online and is now live and in progress. And before that, while CalPADS was being developed, we had CSIS, which was its predecessor, and has been working with all districts and collecting data. So we have made good, steady progress with education data. Also, having said that, as far as linking between K-12 and higher education, we might not need to start from scratch. There are two cross-segment databases already in existence that could be leveraged in some capacity, either both physically and incorporating their staff and the knowledge that they've gained. So there's a higher ed between the CSU, the UC, and the community colleges. They have a common system where they share data, and through CPEC, an organization that it helps with both technical and governance issues across higher ed. So CPEC has a database that has shared higher ed data, so that's already a good start. There's also a system called CalPass, which is a voluntary participation, and it includes some K-12 data, and many of the higher ed segments also have contributed. So as far as our ability to take data from multiple segments, we have some starting points, and we could hopefully leverage that technology and lessons learned. But it still will be a large project, and there will be changes both at the common site where we put the data as well as each of the contributors. So it won't be a fast turnaround.
One more question, Manager. I've repeatedly expressed concern about our assessment and system in California relative to particularly those schools and those individual students who are in communities where there's a lot of transiency or movement of students between districts, military-based towns, for example, or communities with a high percentage of immigrants and low-income workers, and the difficulty in figuring out how a school gets credit for progress if a student's only there for a year and moves to another school and is replaced by another new arrival. It seems like this kind of data collection sharing might lend itself to methodologies for helping to solve that problem.
Yes. Actually, myself, in doing research, that's one of the key things that I'm really excited about, having this longitudinal data. That aspect of longitudinal data will allow you to see, okay, this student's currently in, 10th grade, and they're reading at a third grade reading level, but where were they? Did they just show up at this school, or where were they before? How long were they at that place? And then you can see where they were.
Or vice versa, if a student does very well,
yes,
and is only there makes a lot of progress and advances, but is only there for a short period of time, then how does the school get credit for that in terms of recognizing that they've achieved if that student's replaced with somebody who hasn't had the same success?
Yes, and it will be helpful in assessing not only the schools or the classes the student was in, but programs too. It has program participation, so English learners, what programs were they in, things like that. So it will be helpful.
You mentioned that an area that we have not addressed is a statewide plan to use data to inform instruction. Did you say that?
Yes, and specifically because that requirement, we don't have high-quality plans for these two requirements are very similar, these two criteria. One is really geared around state and local decision makers having access to the data to make their decisions, and the other one is getting data to researchers so they can do research, and that research can improve instruction. So both will improve instruction, but they're sort of how the data is used to improve instruction.
So when we talk about a statewide plan for data to inform instruction, it's more likely it goes around, encompasses this research element of which would help to better inform instruction in the classroom, as opposed to the state looking at student data and trying to inform teachers how to teach to improve student achievement.
Right, because right now each district and each higher ed entity can decide if they want to give data to a researcher or not. And so for a researcher to do statewide research, they need to go around to each district. They can also go to the Department of Education and then each higher ed segment and get data that way, but the data that they have available to them at the local level and the state level is slightly different, and so there's no sort of overarching state plan to say what should or should not be given at those levels.
Okay. And then you say that most, districts have policies relative to how they utilize the data, how they researchers access the data, et cetera. Do you have any data on that to determine who is and who isn't doing that?
I can't give you a specific number, but we looked into this last year to see if there were districts that might need a one-time augmentation to help them get the startup for those local assessment tools, and we really couldn't find any that needed it. So it appeared, we didn't canvass every district, but we used several avenues to survey districts broadly, and the answer came back that virtually all of them have some. Now, several of them are very old, or they'd like to upgrade them, or some are better than others, but virtually all of them have some system, a local assessment tool that they use. Now, how well they use it and how often they do professional development, we haven't looked at that yet. We would have to survey all the districts, but.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any other questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to our first panel, which is, let's see, where are my notes here? Our first panel includes Brad Strong of California Now and Linda Gallagher of the Bay Area Council and Carrick Ashley from the California Department of Education. I'm sorry, Brad Strong of Children Now. What did I say? California Now. Apologize. Welcome and thank you for being here. And we'll begin with Mr. Strong.
Thank you. Brad Strong, Children Now. The one thing about the data is that it is absolutely foundational, and data is clearly woven throughout all of the ARA programs. Race to the Top is certainly no exception, and Stephanie talked about some of the other programs, the State Longitudinal Data System, Enhancing Education Through Technology, teacher quality grants, and all of those. I think the state will be very aggressive in seeking efforts to secure those dollars. And the good news is California has made substantial, I think, progress in recent years, and this does and will help position us to compete in the Race to the Top effort. Specifically, we've made progress on the CalPADS and CalTIDES data systems. We have what I would say is a pretty significant plan. The McKinsey report, which really establishes a framework for a comprehensive educational data system and unlocking the power of data to continually improve public education. We have passed SB 1298 of 2008, which did establish the working groups on governance, access, privacy, and also fortunately made commitments to linking the data from ECE through higher education, which also helps in positioning us to draw down and secure these dollars. And lastly, SB 19, just signed into law, was an important step, and it eliminated the so-called firewall, ensuring eligibility for the Race to the Top application. I think looking back, it's also important to note that I think we've progressed in the way that we think about data. In the 1990s, it was entirely about compliance and accountability. It took some time before we began to think about transparency as being important, and then we started to talk about the policy. How do we make better decisions? How do we inform policy and policy decisions both at the state and local levels, and better decisions? And finally, I think the conversation has meaningfully shifted to including how can we use data to inform instruction and learning. And I think that was really what the McKinsey report is about. I think that's what I think that the Race to the Top is about. How do we make sure we have data systems that kind of do all of that? That they are about assessment. I mean, they're about the accountability. They are about transparency. But they're absolutely about better decisions and how can we use data to inform instruction and learning at the local level. So step one, I think we must comply with the America Competes Act. At the center of this data conversation in ARA is the America Competes Act, with the provisions that were passed in the 2007 America Competes Act and are often referred to as the 10 essential elements. And as Stephanie mentioned, they've added the 2. But in order to secure the state fiscal stabilization funds last spring, California did commit to establishing a longitudinal data system that included the components of the America Competes Act. For the most part, I think we are on track. I see it. Our most immediate hurdle in terms of the essential elements is surrounding the linkages between higher education and pre-K. I think the Senate Bill 1298 of 2008 did initiate those linkages, but we do need to move on the process for actually receiving, issuing, maintaining those identifiers, and reporting the required elements that are part of the America Competes Act. Secretary Duncan often talks about the need for a seamless system, a vision of cradle to career, and we need to make sure that that we're expedient and progress on those connections. How we make it gets complicated. How are we going to ensure that we're issuing identifiers into the pre-K programs, and what's the process, and then what are the data collections and things like that. But I think it's critical that the leadership and you continue to push forward on those efforts. In terms of the race to the top. Beyond the basic requirements, fully implementing the statewide longitudinal data system and related to the 10 essential elements in the America Competes Act, to compete, we do need to do much, much more. They want to know exactly, what exactly is our plan for accessing and using the state data. They'll evaluate the extent to which the state has a high-quality plan to ensure that the data from the statewide longitudinal data system will be accessible to and used to inform, engage key stakeholders, and that the data support decision makers in continuous improvement of instruction, operations, management, and resource allocation. With respect to the statewide the data system plan, I'd argue that we do have one of the best plans in the nation. The McKinsey report should be our guidebook. It details all the critical system work and functionality needed, along with steps and projected costs to get there. So it's not that it has to be verbatim, but certainly that ought to be our guidebook in terms of here's some of the things that are about creating a culture of continuous improvement and learning through the use of data, and the ways that we can most expeditiously leverage the things that we do have in the state to move forward with that. In terms of the key recommendations that I think are important and or critically important that ought to be included in Race to the Top plan, first, an old dog, I'd say at some point we must find a way to support districts in their collection and reporting efforts. We simply need to commit to paying for and asking for the data. We could prioritize this, show the feds that we're serious by making some ongoing commitment to funding data from a small portion of future payments to education, or in some way make that ongoing commitment to the importance of data, and I think that's critical. In the past, we've also failed to ask for data when we need it and could get it. For example, when the state makes huge investments, whether it's the class size reduction, IIUSP, High Priority School Grant Program, the QIA program, we've failed to actually ask for the data in return to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of those programs, and just simply missed opportunities. I think the McKinsey plan does call for an additional 30 data elements, and let's at least move on those that are the most important ones in there now. SAT and ACT scores are needed to compete in the Race to the Top. Stephanie mentioned that we need to include the districts need to submit grades. Attendance, absences, truancies are critical indicators, and that they at least ought to be a minimum requirement for participation of the LEAs in the Race to the Top effort. The pre-K elements are also discussed in the McKinsey, and they're required by the America Competes Act. So those are some of the additional data elements. And I think also, as Stephanie, you're having the conversation about state versus local, one of the things that McKinsey report did is they looked at what are the additional data elements that if we did access that information from the locals, would answer the majority of questions that we have, and things like attendance data. The reason that you have to go to locals in order to get information is that the locals are the ones with the attendance data. The state currently doesn't have that. So if we did pull those additional 30 data elements up to the state, we could deal with some of the need for the researchers being able to go to the state rather than going to each separate district individually to try to get those together. In terms of being able to really provide access to information for teachers and principals, they must be able to access the data real time. We need a central portal. Ohio has an online assessment reporting system that allows teachers and principals to log in, access user-based reports, learn from professional development tools for using online reports, build practice tests, access diagnostic tests, all of these are which are similarly scoped out in the as a portal concept in the McKinsey report. And this essentially would become the hub of information where all of the best resources could be provided for districts and teachers to come and access that information.
Mr. Strong, I've got a time management issue here, so I want to hear your report, but as concise as possible. It would be much appreciated.
Why don't I go ahead and close and allow questions if that...
Okay, great. Ms. Gallagher, and thank you. I understand that you had to battle the Bay Bridge today to get here, so...
I came on 37. That was tricky.
A lot more time to get here than you anticipated, and we really appreciate your presence.
Chairman Brownlee, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to appear here today. I'm Linda Gallagher, and I'm the Vice President of Education for the Bay Area Council. The Bay Area Council represents hundreds of the largest employers in California on public policy that affect global competitiveness, the economy, and sustainability. In the history of our organization, no education issue has galvanized the support of our leadership as strongly as they now support the build-out of this education data system. Business leaders get this issue. They get it without need for discussion or persuasion. They already know the criticality of good information to continuous improvement. It is a daily part of life running a successful enterprise. When support of the data system was proposed to our top executive leadership as a recommended priority within our strategic plan, the response was quite brief. It's a no-brainer. End of story. California has a problem with education. We have to make a very expensive system work better, much better. We can't just put more money into the same system. That won't fix education any more than it will fix healthcare. Education may need more money, but we have to spend it wisely. We can't afford to pay for treatments that don't work in healthcare or in education. President Obama declared when he took office that his administration would examine all federal governments with one criteria: what works. We must do the same. Where that starts is with data. Schools routinely gather great amounts of data. What is important is that we turn that data into information. Data becomes useful information through analysis and effective communication. Without good information, we cannot make the dramatic improvements in education that California must make, not only to remain competitive, but to lead the nation as an economic powerhouse. It is a tragic confluence of pain that we must face a recession and budget cuts at the same time as we as education stakeholders have come together to face the hard facts that we must change what we're doing in order to save our children and our state from an unsustainable education status quo. We have a legacy system of education that still results in haves and have-nots. The graduates that are the output of the education system are the input to industry and society. The more they're prepared for the 21st century, the greater their contributions to their own prosperity and the economy, and vice versa. Fortunately, good information is an exciting and highly effective tool for educating all kids. Our most successful teachers and schools are highly data-driven. Good data generated by, with, or for a well-trained teacher can provide the information needed to zero in daily on each student's progress at an individual level. Students become engaged by viewing their own progress. Success breeds success. Not only individual students, but whole classrooms and schools can revel in the upward climb of numbers on a chart. Hope and excitement can be generated by a teacher's clever use of data to signify forward momentum and learning accomplished. Teachers trained to use data daily start by aligning lesson plans with the standards and then measuring progress toward goals. Data gives that teacher, principal, and parent a light to shine on each student's progress, empowering all to understand what needs more work and when they will get it right. To support this system of feedback loops, we must be sure that teachers and administrators are well trained. This will develop a culture of data in our schools. Above the classroom level, improvements can be accomplished with data analysis at the school, the district, and the state level. They can answer many questions that will streamline the system and help us direct more funding to what works. We're just on the threshold of generating hundreds of questions that will need to be answered, and the answers will generate more questions. How much does attendance matter? Mobility, socioeconomic status, discipline, class size, teacher credentials, professional development. Where is the achievement gap being impacted and how? And on and on. These are some of the many questions we must answer to improve the human capital pipeline. It's not only about 21st century graduates, but also about spending our precious tax dollars wisely and effectively. It's about cost-benefit analysis and return on investment. California has a vast talent pool that the next generation must replace. We have a high concentration of knowledge-based occupations, with many companies locating here to tap into that talent pool. Other regions around the world are competing with us for business location. Our education system must prepare all segments of the population to contribute to our economy. It takes a chain of successful teachers to produce engineers, nurses, designers, mechanics, etc. Programs must be engaging and continuously improved to inspire demand and enable successful graduation. It's a talent pipeline. There's an axiom in the business world: what gets measured gets managed. Information is the key to an effective and efficient talent pipeline. The use of data is clearly and routinely the tool of choice with teachers, schools, and districts that are outperforming expectations, and we must urgently expand that use. Our future depends on it.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Carrick Ashley from the California Department of Education.
Thank you. I'll just give you a brief update of where we are in the development and implementation of CalPADS, a couple of challenges, and I'll try not to repeat any of the eloquent remarks already made by Linda and Brad on this topic. As you've heard, CalPADS did roll out this year. At the end of August, we released the functionality for districts to go in and to assign who would have access within their local educational agency to access their data. They submit an application as to who that would be, and from there, that's the gatekeeper. That person in the district is the gatekeeper of who else in the district will have access to that data. Then on October 5th, we rolled out the first major functionality of the system, which is to maintain and report statewide student identifiers, the SSIDs, which is responsible for how we collect enrollment, how we determine dropouts and graduate data. Later on in November, we'll roll out the next functionality, which is about teacher data. And then from there, we'll add in January, February timeframe, the assessment data that will get loaded into CalPADS, the last 3 years of assessment data. And that statewide assessment data, which is important to know the difference, that the assessment data that will be loaded into CalPADS, the California Standards Test, the High School Exit Exam, CASE, and the CELT, which is the English Language Development Test. So it's the statewide assessment data that gets loaded into CalPADS. In the spring, we'll roll out the language census. That's the annual count of our English learners in the state. And then at the end of the year, in June, we'll roll out the functionality for districts to report to us course completion data, course credits earned, and the grades that go along with those courses. Getting to Assemblymember Chesbro's question, the first 2 weeks that we rolled out the first functionality, the major functionality in CalPADS was a slow start. The system was slow. Over 1,300 LEAs were trying to access it at the same time, and we asked them, and they apparently listened to us. They took downloads of their data.
The other ones have taken decades, so 2 weeks we wouldn't get too nervous about.
So the performance since then, IBM has addressed those issues along with their partners, and the performance is much better than it was those first 2 weeks. I will say that 3 years ago, when the plan was first put into place, it was to roll it out in 2009-10, which they have done on time, and IBM is within their budget. So far, so good. Proof is in the pudding. By the end of the year, if you want me to come back and give you an update on how things were going, I'd be glad to do that. But getting on to Race to the Top and the future of where we are with this data system, this is probably, if I were to choose my time to roll out a major data system, it would not be now. But we really don't have a choice in that. The resources are just not available for local school districts to put effort toward this. When you have a major project to implement for the first time, normally a school district would gather up some extra resources and throw it at the project until they understand how it's going to work and put into business processes to do it on a regular basis, but they just don't have those resources to throw at it. So I'm not worried about the technology working, though I'm probably not sleeping as many hours in the evening as I usually do. I am somewhat worried, but we'll get the technology to work. What I'm concerned about are local school districts having the resources and the wherewithal to actually submit the data to us. It's a new type of data reporting to submit individual student records to the state. That's just a different type of reporting from the past. And it does take effort, it does take resources to do that. But we'll get the technology working, and then there's got to be a lot of training and hopefully some resources from somewhere to help school districts with actually reporting the data on time and accurately. One of the other challenges, of course, is that the training is not only in submitting the data, which is what the training is now. I think you've heard before. The training then needs to take the next step. Now that we have the data and it's in the system, how are we going to use it, and how is it going to be used? But let's be clear about the data that's currently in the system. It was built to meet NCLB reporting requirements, and so it's very good for doing that. It will meet our reporting requirements. It will help us with accountability data, which is to see how school data compares from year to year, or even classroom data, how it compares from year to year. A teacher can look at some of that data and see, as a class, where are some of the weaknesses or the strengths. But again, this is snapshot data taken once a year. This is not the local assessment data that you heard others talk about. That local assessment data is the data that's going to help a teacher on the 28th of October decide what it is that he or she is going to teach on the 29th of October. The data that's currently residing in CalPADS or will reside in CalPADS is not that data. Local assessment data is different from the statewide assessment that's going to be into the system. So training not only has to be given to know how to use the data in CalPADS, but we also need training for teachers and principals to know how to use that local assessment data in order to improve instruction. So I'll leave it at that and take any questions.
Thank you very much. Questions? The panel? Mr. Torlakson?
Can I? I'm sorry.
Just one follow-on to our good representative from the Department of Ed. So, if the resources aren't there in the way you would hope, what do you envision happening across the 1,000+ school districts?
Right.
How is it going to affect the total end product, and
right.
What do you do about it?
Right. So again, because it's accountability data, we'll be able to meet our reporting requirements, and on a percentage basis, the data will be good enough to make certain decisions. But I think we have to go in it with open eyes that in the current state that we are and the lack of resources out there, I wouldn't be surprised at all that some districts will not be able to submit 100% of the data to us in spite of the technology working to accept the data. I mentioned on October 5th we rolled out the first major functionality of the system. There are still 135, as of today, 135 school districts, many of them actually independently reporting charter schools, that haven't even submitted an application to access the system, in spite of weekly emails and now phone calls going to them. So, you know, and they're just, you know, they're just trying to meet their own requirements, let alone ours. So we may not get a data set this first year that includes 100% from everyone. We may be scrambling at the end of the year and pleading and urging and
Do you know
polling.
what the costs are for an annual cost to do this right in terms of getting local data?
Well, I know 5 years
training?
ago when we started going down this road, you know, the Superintendent O'Connell did put a proposal out for a $5 per pupil for local data activities. And those local data activities could be the use of hardware, the use of software, training personnel, retraining people, training people who, you know, new people to replace others that have left. I think that was a fairly modest proposal. When we did a survey of most of the districts, it really came out to more of an average of $10 per pupil.
I can't do the math, but what's that in the aggregate?
About $32 million.
About $32 million, okay. Any other questions? See none. Thank you very much for being here. And we'll move to our next panel, which is Cynthia Cooper, who's a teacher in the Oak Grove School District in the San Jose area, and Debbie Look of the California PTA, and Sherry Griffith with the Association of California School Administrators. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Sherry Griffith with the Association of California School Administrators, and thank you for having us today. We actually concur with all of the criteria in the RTT requirements for high-quality plans to collect and use P20 data. And what we'd just like to share briefly today is a little bit of a different take on the use of the data in regards to supporting instruction. We think that there are two equally important functions in regards to the use of longitudinal data. One is local, and in that arena we think that the data is definitely to be used for teachers, parents, administrators, and the community to make sure that our students are on track, they are in the right classes, they have the right services, and we continue to progress academically for every student. You can imagine, though there are challenges, how exciting this is for our members who now will be able to receive data over time when students come to their district and school. Let's say they're a migrant population. Let's say they are a student that is high risk, and we need to track what progress they've made in the past. And also for our students with disabilities and ensuring that we're tying their IEPs and other data to making important instructional decisions for their future. So we see the importance of CalPADS not only for assessment data, which you know we discussed all morning, but really the actual placement and tracking of students to ensure that they get what they need quickly. At the state level, we think there's a different role for the state to play in using this data. Number one, and we think you should consider this in the application for RTT, that you are going to be committed as a state to looking at using this data over time to gauge the effectiveness or the lack of effectiveness of the current programs that the state has created or developed over time, and that we ensure that we eliminate any ineffective programs no longer serving California's needs. We think this is one of the highest priorities for the use of the new longitudinal system. In addition to that, we think we need to do an ongoing review of the programs that are in place that we necessarily won't eliminate but need to improve at the state level. That would include our IHEs, the universities and their education programs for our teachers, our special programs in professional development such as BITSA, making sure that all these programs actually are serving the needs of our educators in California and our students. Another area that we think is critical and should be included, I think, as part of the competition in RTT, but also what you discussed in standards and assessment, is looking actually at evaluating such things as instructional programs. For example, this state spends millions of dollars on instructional programs that you approve, textbooks in K through 12. We have no idea how effective those programs are. We've never really looked at that except what the publishers tell us. So we think you could use this data, again, to link to that area. Some of the suggestions we have in regards to the use of the data in really quickly, I think, in the application, just looking at the application right now, would be that you consider, as I said, prioritizing how you're going to look at state programs for effectiveness, let the federal government know that's how you want to use your longitudinal system, that you really make a priority out of what Mr. Ashley has indicated for the use of the funds, and that is providing the support for classified, certificated, and administrative staff at the site level and district level for gathering, input, and analysis of data of all types. Remember, at the school site, you're going to have the secretary inputting this data, and if they do not know how the system works, that's problematic. We have been advocates along with the department in ensuring that that is a top priority for any future funding. We also think you can use the CalPAD system as well as just general data to ensure that we are promoting best practices not only in instructional strategies and using the website to inform teachers of good things happening in other districts, which you can use in a system like this, but also best practices for the issues that came up in this committee before on the data firewall. What best practices do we have in districts today for comprehensive evaluation systems for teachers and principals? We know there are districts doing really good work in that area. And finally, it was mentioned by Dr. Weiss and others, we think that the statewide system can help us develop the data banks for test questions so that our teachers and principals can develop formative assessments. So those are some of our ideas. We have more to share, but we'll put that in writing to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Griffith. And Ms. Look.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of almost 1 million members throughout California to represent the parent voice in education. We know that research clearly shows that parent involvement plays a vital role in determining a student's success in school. And in order to effectively partner with school and teachers, parents need clear, understandable data on their students' achievement. We've been advocating for a comprehensive statewide assessment and data system that measures individual student achievement over time for many years. We know that this, as discussed earlier, that the assessment system must not be based on a single test, but must be comprehensive and include alignment with content standards, instructional materials, and classroom instruction. The systematic use of data to guide instruction is a key factor in improving student outcomes, including achievement rates in high-poverty schools and closing the achievement gap, very high priorities for our organization. In 2008, our convention delegates overwhelmingly called for a development and full funding of a longitudinal statewide data system, as well as doing the formative assessments for classroom instruction, making key data available for resource allocations, as well as meeting federal requirements for a growth model. The lack of a statewide data system has meant that most schools, districts, and the state have not had the ability to measure the progress of individual students over time, the effectiveness of particular programs or interventions in student achievement, or even our dropout and graduation rates. The Getting Down to Facts studies clearly showed that the lack of data and information in California has significantly impeded the efforts of state and local decision makers to improve resource allocation and guide school improvement decisions. And particularly in these tough economic times, this is critically important. We can't expect effective education reform if we don't have access to valid data on what works. We fully support the Race to the Top program's calls to implement a statewide data system, to make that data available to all key stakeholders, including students and parents, to use data to inform instructions, and to use data to engage students and parents in the success of students. We agree that student achievement success is a shared responsibility between students, parents, and teachers. And to uphold this responsibility, all partners need quality and timely data. Regardless of whether California is successful in securing Race to the Top funds or not, educators must be able to provide parents with information that is clear and understandable about the standards that students are expected to achieve and the degree to which their student is meeting those standards. We have to recognize that there's a broad need of range of needs within the parent community, both in terms of language needs, ability to understand data, and ability to access data. We also need to provide opportunities for training of parents in understanding and using this data to support their students. In addition, of course, educators will need training and support to use data to inform their classroom instruction and improve student achievement. We fully support efforts through the RTT program to effectively link data from preschool through higher education. We know that quality preschool experiences are contributing to success in K-12, and we feel this data will only enhance that ability to understand that. In addition, that connections, success in data on higher education will allow us to better improve instruction in high school, where we currently do not have that level of data to improve that. Clearly, strict policies and procedures must be in place to safeguard privacy of individual student data, and that we look forward to working with legislators, governors, and our educational partners in developing a plan that ensures California is both eligible and competitive in its race to the top applications. We believe that these funds will allow us to fully develop and deploy a data system that goes beyond reporting requirements towards a system that makes a real difference, allowing us to evaluate the innovative interventions that the Obama administration is calling for. We want to know what works based on real data, not just anecdotal information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Ms. Cooper, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Was Cynthia Cooper. I'm a third grade teacher. I teach in Oak Grove School District in San Jose, California. I'm very happy to be here, and I spent the majority of my career with the Oak Grove School District. I come here today fresh from multiple days of bargaining. At our bargaining table, we discussed the impact of the ideas and proposals, initiatives like Race to the Top. Race to the Top makes me feel that I'm on a treadmill and someone else is increasing the speed. The pressure in each individual in the classroom to raise their test scores is on and on and on. I'm here today to contribute to the committee's conversation about using data to inform information and instruction. The draft regulations that the federal Race to the Top program are proof positive that it's easier to obsess about process and pay minimal attention to results. In particular, the proposed guidance for RTT states that it's difficult to predict teacher quality based on the qualifications that teachers bring to the job. It goes on to say that one of the most effective ways to accurately assess teacher quality is to measure the growth and the achievement of teachers' students. I could not disagree more. What makes an effective teacher? My district and the association has learned a lot together in working to answer the question in meaningful ways. Effective teachers are easily distinguished by what they bring to the classroom, a set skill and training, and what they do in the classroom, processes and methods uniformly used. That impacts student development and achievement over time. Effective teachers develop in a school climate that supports professional growth and development over time. I would like you to refer to the handouts that I've given you. My handout includes excerpts of teachers' contracts that describe how student data should be used as part of the teacher's evaluation. After all, a few people who more is interested in improving teaching than teachers. It's the subject of our lunchroom conversations, our informal mentoring, and our formal process as well. Note that the contract provides provisions focus on the relationship between the California State Testing Program, the state standards, and an evaluation matrix that includes multiple measures of student and teacher performance. And I'm hoping you're looking at this one. Okay. We were purposeful in making the decision to blend the California standards for the teaching profession into our evaluation. On a practical level, we think that we have designed a contract at the bargaining table that will implement evaluation practices that will promote reflection about student learning and teaching practices, formulate professional goals to improve teaching practice, and guide, mentor, monitor, and assess the progress of a teacher's practice toward professional goals and professionally accepted benchmarks. I want to draw your attention to the Standard 5 to look at the way our worksheets use the organization of the CSTP assessment standard in elements that identify multiple facets of using assessment to inform instruction. Within this standard, Oak Grove teachers understand that the worksheets address only a sample of the important facets of using data to inform. They do not represent all the possible issues or aspects of teaching. This worksheet is not to be used simply as a checklist, but to promote reflection and professional development. Talking in Sacramento about data-driven instruction ignores the realities of implementing the data-driven instruction in the classroom. In my district, we have implemented a plan that works effectively. It provides data to teachers that they can use to help their students acquire the skills and knowledge that they need to meet and exceed state standards. And even more, provides a clear link between this information and appraisals of teacher effectiveness. Teachers should never find themselves in a situation where they're teaching to a test. Yet, the pressure is on at all levels to focus to pushing improving assessment scores. Before we start in the fall, we look at the STAR tests and decide as a team where our students are weak. This year, it was a main idea in supporting details for third grade. We make sure we repeat this concept in almost every lesson. My students get a binder with the release questions for STAR tests and even practice bubbling in the answer sheet. This practice occurs even though third grade marks in a test booklet. We don't use bubble sheets on the STAR test. This district has developed language and assessments for fall, winter, and spring that are aligned with the pacing guides for the Houghton-Mifflin in reading and McGraw-Hill in math. There is a growing diversity among the students in my district, and I believe that diversity can greatly enrich my teaching and their experiences as a learner. We have worked at my school and across the district to support the use of multiple measures to drive the decisions we make to introduce and reteach content to the students. In math, third grade has more concepts to master than any other grade, and a huge performance gap is passed over between second and third grade. For example, my third graders need to do long division with remainders, ratios, probability, read statistics off of a graph, pie chart, bar graphs, line graphs. If a student also has reading comprehension, critical thinking, and problem-solving activities as well. We do a lot of small group instruction, and I am fortunate to have several volunteers, including a high school student, to assist me with small groups. At some moment between the publication of the test scores at the end of August and the day the classes begin, I need to download and analyze the performance of the students. It's expected that one size fits all in third grade in California, but the needs of the children are not the same. One of the greatest challenges regarding the huge amount of data schools receive as a result of state testing is how to use it. Oak Grove is hardly unique in having spelled out and implemented an effective program that helps teachers improve students' performance on their own. My local Teachers Association and our district have worked together to make this mandate work. And we've learned some important lessons along the way. First, we've learned how to use student data to set professional development priorities at our school site level. After all, continuing learning for teachers is vital to support effective learning for students, and that can be done most effectively at the local level. Second, we've learned how to look at a school plan in its holistic way, avoiding the mistake of concentrating on one element of a learning environment without considering its impact on the entire program. Third, we've learned to look at and plan for our students' growth in terms of the efforts of the individual teacher and the entire school. After all, providing each and every student with a highly qualified education is the mission of everyone at our school site. And everyone plays a vital role in achieving the mission. Working together, we have established synergy. Fourth, we've learned how to use student assessments as a guide to improve professional practice. We work to implement the best practices in every classroom in Oak Grove School District. I thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much. Any questions of the panel? We're squeezing in on 1 o'clock, so that's when we have to be out of here, and we also have public comment. But if there's any questions for the panel, Mr. Torlakson.
Just to our last good speaker and teacher, and it's been touched on by other panelists, but you mentioned multiple measures.
Yes.
And so, we have this system currently that drives so much of what we do, and life is not a multiple choice test. And so in your view, what are some of the other multiple assessments that could look at the whole child and the whole learning experience that's going on?
Part of the problem that I find, just ADA, average daily attendance, that's a number. Many of our students come to school on time, but leave before lunch is over. That's a factor that you can't add into your curriculum. H1N1, the virus has hit. I've had 7 students out. Those are things you can't put into a data system to say what affects their learning. We have a lot of parent volunteer. We have a lot of parent clubs. It's a buy-in that education is important. Informing them is one of the things that I think communication is key, whether you're trying to tell them what the numbers are or ask them how they can help you help their child. So for me as a teacher in the classroom every day for 36 years, that's what's been most effective for me, trying to get good communication and informing people what the new changes are and how we plan to work this together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Carter.
Just a quick comment. Listening to the teacher, now we see why students don't feel education is relevant to them in the classroom.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate your time and commitment to this hearing. We have about 10 more minutes, and I'd like to make an offer to anyone who, in terms of public comment, who may wish to forego but expand on their public comments, because we would commit to posting public comments on the committee's website. Your comments are very important to us, but we're likely to run out of time here. I'm going to limit everybody, I see, to 1 minute, and we'll see how it goes. But we may have to, unfortunately, say we've got to leave. So I apologize for that.
Good afternoon.
Please, go
My
ahead.
name is Kathy Harris. I'm a teacher in Santa Rosa and a former director for the California Reading and Literature Project. And I wanted to give a few comments. I am submitting written comments with more details about the local, what's going on in my school.
Very good.
Standardized testing is a critical component of our educational system. I believe that now, and I've always believed it. I think that if we as educators are doing our jobs, then our students should perform well on standardized tests, whether they're criterion referenced, like our current CST, or norm referenced, like the CAT-6. The snapshot of learning that we get from our CST results does give us a place to start on the other types of assessment that we use at the local level, and I want to acknowledge that and emphasize that. The use of data to improve instruction is the most powerful and important use of student assessment data, and California has invested lots and lots of time, money, and energy to make sure that educators know how to analyze, interpret, and use data to improve the learning of the students in our care. We have 4 types of data that we use in California. We have screening assessments that tell us where a student is, do they have the prerequisite skills that they need. We have diagnostic assessments that tell us which skills they don't have if they aren't performing well on comprehensive assessments. We have progress monitoring assessments that tell us, are all of the students benefiting from our instruction? And then we have the summative data, of which the CST data is an example.
I'm going to have to interrupt you there. I
Yes.
apologize, but you're well over a minute, and I've just got to ask you to conclude, and we'll look forward to your written comments and take them very seriously.
My main point would be that we are using these data actively at our school sites, and that you really consider the consequences of race to the top criteria as we move forward and make sure that what we do doesn't hinder but enhances what we're doing at schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Roberta Ferger speaking on behalf of PICO California, a faith-based community organizing network representing 450,000 families. Also on behalf of one of our partners, Public Advocates. Timely and accurate availability of data is really critical for parents, students, and community members. It's even more critical now that we're driving decision-making for funding or budget decisions to the local level. And for parents to be active participants in that process, they have to have access to the information. Otherwise, they're not meaningful participants. Also just want to echo the point that providing resources and training at the local level is really critical. The information at the state level is only as good as its input locally. So if we're going to make decisions based on this, it has to be timely and it has to be accurate. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, members, Fred Jones representing two educator groups, the California Council for the Social Studies and the California Business Education Association. And what connects the theme of concerns is narrowing of curriculum. That has been one of the consequences of No Child Left Behind. So as we race to the top, want to make sure that we're engaging children in relevant curriculum. Michelle Herzog mentioned that earlier about engaging. On history, social science, and science, where are they in the discussion? So again, that's already been touched upon, but that is a concern because that is part of the core academic content areas. With my business educators, career technical education is a concern. It is an elephant in the room, and appropriately so, and we need to address it. And there are some soft skills and hard skills that are uniquely taught in a career technical education arena that aren't taught in the core academics that need to be included as we try to become globally competitive. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jeff Freitas with the California Federation of Teachers, and after a very informative hearing, would like to emphasize just on a few areas. First of all, I believe that the state needs to look at what we can do for the state, what we can do for California, and what's aligned with Race to the Top, but doing it regardless of whether we get the money or not. One of the things is we need to look at the standards, which we've been asking to do for the last few years, and we need to make sure that those standards are spiraling and that they're aligned grade level to grade level, and not to commit to adopt blindly any national standards. The second thing is the data, making sure that anything that we do with the data is it's primarily to inform instruction and classroom needs. And one of the examples there in terms of classroom needs is like a student-weighted formula that we've been trying to push within California, and how we can use that data to help those schools. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ernie Silva on behalf of the School for Integrated Academics and Technologies, Sciatec High School. We've had difficulties with some of the National Governors Association standards because they leave out schools and students like ours. So I just want to again throw out a caution, and we'll submit written comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Martha Zaragoza Diaz, representing Californians Together Coalition and the California Association for Bilingual Education. I will forward to you written comments, but I do want to just bring to your attention that there is a technical advisory panel on uniform national rules for NAEP testing of English learners, and they provided recommendations to the assessment governing board that I would like to leave with you for you to take a look at and for you to consider including the appropriate ELL accommodations with regards to the NAEP, since the NAEP is referred to in the RTTT. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our public comment. And as the clock strikes 1 o'clock, it is time to adjourn. And just a reminder that our next hearing will be at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, November 18th, in Southern California at the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California boardroom. And we hope that many of you can join us in Los Angeles. Thank you very much for everyone who participated in this hearing today. I felt like it was a very good hearing, and thank you, and we will see you November 18th. Thank you very much. The meeting's adjourned. Yeah. Hey, Mike, how are you?
We did our own